I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning to everybody, and I hope it is in fact a good morning for you. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 892 new coronavirus deaths and 58,764 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 54,810 cases per day. That's a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 29,957,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while more than 543,000 have died from it. One quick prediction here. We're going to pass 30 million cases tomorrow, and people are going to talk about it, including us on this show. But there you go, about 43,000 cases away from that, and it's the middle of the week. I could be wrong. It could drop back down to like 5-month lows, but I kind of doubt it. Sad to say, Vladimir Putin has been vaccinated against COVID-19. The Kremlin has not specified which vaccine Putin received. The aim was to underline that, quote, all 3 Russian vaccines are absolutely reliable, very good, and effective, end quote. The vaccination was not lively publicized, and when asked if people would believe Putin actually received the shot, spokesman Dmitry Peskov said people would just have to, quote, take our word for it, end quote. And I would. Employers such as Target, Trader Joe's, McDonald's, and Dollar General are among a growing list of companies giving workers time off and extra money to get vaccinated for COVID-19. Krispy Kreme Donuts is offering anyone with proof of COVID vaccination a free donut. A marijuana dispensary in Walled Lake, Michigan is giving anyone over the age of 21 with proof of vaccination a free pre-rolled joint. According to a report by the Society for Human Resource Management, nearly 1/4 of employed Americans who won't get vaccinated would consider getting their shot if offered a cash bonus or stipend, or for that matter, donut or joint, or really donut and joint, not in that order, but you get what I'm putting down on the table there, Jamarl. Countries across the globe took to the streets last weekend to demand an end to their government's coronavirus regulations, marking the first anniversary of coronavirus lockdowns in several nations. Participants in the Worldwide Rally for Freedom marched in Canada, the USA, Uruguay, Argentina, Ireland, Britain, Norway, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Croatia, Serbia, Ukraine, Japan, and Australia, among other countries. There are a lot of countries there to have an among other countries at the end, to protest lockdowns, mask mandates, and the promotion of the COVID-19 vaccines. People are wary of this stuff. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said that Tuesday that coronavirus infections are rising too fast to allow a relaxation of the country's tough lockdown, and instead extended it for a further 3 weeks. This comes after Germany also extended its lockdown for 3 more weeks. And we've seen protests over the course of the last year in the USA, although they've been rather muted. Recently, though, the Netherlands has been like off the hook with the anti-COVID protests. We've been covering that in headlines, and Germany, that was again just a couple of days ago. But these are quite a few countries to see protests. And now, granted, I'm guessing that some of these protests are a bit smaller, and they're just being thrown into the batch because that's how these lists work. Is you sort of round everyone up, no matter the size or intensity. But nevertheless, that's the headline. And in national political news, U.S. President Joe Biden will join a video summit of European Union leaders on Thursday to discuss improving transatlantic cooperation. The 27 EU leaders have a regular 2-day summit starting Thursday, where they will discuss everything from vaccine strategy to relations with Russia. A phone call between Biden and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen clinched a trade breakthrough with a 4-month suspension of tariffs used in the long-standing Airbus-Boeing dispute. The dispute stems from the European Union and the United States claiming that each other's airplane manufacturer is unfairly subsidized. Stop giving your airplane manufacturer money, effectively, each is saying to the other. Sure, they each just want to keep doing that, though. Puerto Rico has been granted immediate access to $912 million in federal funds that had not been available to students in public and private schools on the island as a result of restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. This was announced on Monday by Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona. The new funds came less than 2 weeks after Puerto Rico reopened dozens of public and private schools for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic began. The state of New York saw several different protests over the weekend as residents took part in a Tax the Rich march and also attended dueling rallies against and in support of Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has come under fire for his flawed response, deadly response to COVID-19, as well as for lying about it and trying to cover it up from Trump's DOJ. Also, more notably for some perhaps, for his string of recent sexual harassment allegations, which started with one allegation and then quickly grew to like half a dozen. And we've been talking about that for about a month and a half at this point, pretty much a month and a half straight, every week doing at least one or two shows on that topic. Anyway, that has definitely been building. And it started with, I'll put it like this, when it starts with grandmothers dying, it's not going to end well. And it's not ending well, but it's not over yet. So I'll just step back from that last sentence and we'll see where it actually goes. In international news, Russia's foreign envoy Sergei Lavrov said that relations between the EU and Russia had been destroyed unilaterally by decisions made in Brussels, saying that Russia no longer had relations with the EU after Brussels destroyed them. This came during a conversation in Beijing with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, during which both of them called the latest batches of sanctions against the two countries interference. China on Tuesday, meanwhile, threatened retaliation against the U.S. over sanctions that targeted Beijing's alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang province, with top Chinese officials vowing that America and its allies will, quote, pay a price for their ignorance and arrogance, end quote. The sanctions announced Monday by the U.S., Canada, United Kingdom, and European Union mark the latest international step to condemn and punish China for its treatment of Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups in Xinjiang. Chinese Communist Party officials denied the allegations made by the Biden administration and issued a fiery defense that attacked the U.S. for its history of slavery, the deaths of civilians in Afghanistan and Syria, and the treatment of indigenous peoples across North America. Meanwhile, North Korea has test-fired 2 short-range cruise missiles over the weekend, according to South Korean defense officials confirming this Wednesday. The test took place off the west coast of North Korea on Sunday, just days after the country accused the United States and South Korea of raising a stink on the Korean peninsula with their annual military drills. It did not violate United Nations resolutions, which ban North Korea from developing or testing ballistic missile technologies. However, it did mark the first tests of missiles since Biden has taken office. A U.S. senator urged the Biden administration Tuesday to lift a ban on diesel fuel swaps with Venezuela, arguing that sanctions are worsening the South American country's dire humanitarian crisis. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, a Democratic member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for the U.S. to end what he called the quote-unquote misguided policy. He said that immediately restoring diesel swaps would provide life-saving relief for millions of Venezuelans, end quote, and that the ban has, quote, created no real political leverage with Maduro, who is able to maneuver around the unilateral sanctions, end quote. Jamal, I'm going to actually turn to you here. We're talking about Venezuela and argument in Congress driven by Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for the U.S. to end its misguided sanctions policy, basically saying that it has led to a situation where we have no real political leverage. By severing their ties to us, we're also like severing our ties to them in some sense, and we're leaving ourselves without useful ways to turn the screws in negotiations with them, in the same way that, Iran, after decades of being under sanctions, has had to seek some degree of economic autarky, independence, self-sufficiency, that kind of thing. And we can no longer, decide to tighten up trade flows or stop our imports of certain resources or exports of certain resources. You get what I'm saying? And the same thing holds true with Venezuela. That seems to be a deep problem with our sanction-backed foreign policy in general. What's your take, Jamal?
Yeah, I think you're right. If you sanction the world, at some point, the world is going to get familiar and used to those sanctions. And if you can't destroy the country is going to have to find some way to be more self-sufficient. I mean, look at Cuba. Look at Russia. I mean, Russia flourished under those sanctions, from my understanding, at least my reading on it. Smaller countries like Venezuela and Iran take a blunt boot to this, especially doing something like COVID. And so, yeah, I mean, these guys are looking for things that they can use to basically break, injure, murder maim to try to get the government to basically collapse so they can put in somebody else who they want. And they don't care about the number of people who they injure in that. They don't care the number of hardships that they create. Those hardships matter less than having somebody that we care about. It's grotesquely racist. But his issue with it is not because they're acts of war. His issue is we need to find better ways that we can break and tighten the screws. COVID was one of those ways where we can use our vaccine to get, political gains out of various groups.
Oh, that's just great, gross. Isn't it?
Yeah.
That's just fantastic. The idea being, we will not give you our vaccine until you change certain aspects of your political system.
And by the way, complaining that China and Russia, that the issue with those countries is that they're willing to give the vaccine without hinges to it. Meaning they give the vaccine away. Leverage. I tried to tell my mom, I said, yeah, the U.S. has an issue because China and Russia are giving it away. She says, that's how you're supposed to do it, right? I said, well, from our standpoint, we use that stuff for foreign policy needs where they're interlacing reasons for, various rules. But basically, yes, we use our vaccine in some respects as a foreign policy cudgel. And that if that strikes you wrong, then you're a human being and it should.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, it is gross. And it's just the weirdest argument to make. It's just when Psaki said that, do you hear what you're saying? Do you hear yourself? Is this for a long time the United States has seen itself as the leader of the world? Is that really what kind of leadership we want to express? Apparently. They're high on their own supply, man. These guys are crazy. I've got to move on here, though. Back to the headlines. The Biden administration recently reimposed sanctions on Israeli businessman Dan Gertler over alleged massive corruption in the Democratic Republic of Congo's lucrative mining business. The sanctions had been introduced for his allegedly corrupt relationship with the Democratic Republic of Congo's former president, Joseph Kabila, helping him make a vast fortune from copper and cobalt deals in the country. In Myanmar, hundreds of people imprisoned for protesting last month's coup were released this Wednesday in the first apparent gesture by the military to try to placate the protest movement. Prisoners appeared to be the hundreds of students detained in early March while demonstrating against the February 1st coup. Dane Saw, a journalist for the Associated Press who was arrested last month while covering a protest against the coup in Myanmar, was also released from detention on Wednesday. Saudi Arabia's top diplomat announced on Monday a proposal to the end of the 6-year conflict in Yemen, including an offer of a ceasefire and political agreement with the Iran-backed Houthi rebels who control strategic parts of the country. One Houthi official dismissed the initiative as, quote, not serious or new. Mohammed Abdel Salam said on Twitter that any agreement must address a Saudi air and sea blockade, which has deprived the Houthis of income from oil taxes and hampered humanitarian agencies' ability to deliver aid, including food. President Joe Biden announced earlier this year that the U.S. would end support for Saudi Arabia's offensive operations in Yemen, although we apparently still support their defensive operations as Yemeni rebels try to strike back against their invasion of the country. It's just, just pointing it out. 2 Taiwanese fighter jets crashed into the sea off the island's southeastern coast on Monday after apparently colliding in midair during a training mission. The crashes of the F-5E fighters came at a moment of heightened tensions between Taiwan and mainland China. On Monday, it was reported that Taiwan's Air Force is well-trained and well-equipped with mostly U.S.-made assets, but is dwarfed by China's own expanding military muscle. Taiwanese air officials said both of the jets that crashed had a pilot aboard. One pilot was found and airlifted to a medical facility, but later died, while the other is still missing. Oh, and brief update here, Israel's election has no clear sort of decisive winner, although Netanyahu's Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, took home the most votes. So not enough to create a sort of overwhelming coalition government with the power to get what it really wants, but enough to keep Netanyahu in power while his corruption trial has been put on hold to process the results of the election. Over 90% of the vote is in. We'll be talking more about this soon. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and the rest of today's show. See you on the other side.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C., and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri, daily for our analytical fix. No surrender!
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever the platform you're consuming this on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in on the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. You know, just because you do good, it doesn't necessarily mean good follows. And what I mean by that is taking a good action that is moral, that is ethical, oftentimes requires a certain degree of let's say, displacement. Sometimes not necessarily doing something that is in your own best interest, but doing it for somebody else. And in doing so, you take somewhat of a penalty. You absorb that penalty because you believe that whatever you're absorbing the penalty for matters more. It's an ethical choice. That said, just because the choice is ethical, just because the choice is moral, there is nothing within the fabric of the cosmos that makes sure it turns out right. That makes sure the ends up as good as your intentions. Reality just doesn't work that way. It's possible, but it's also possible that it's not. It's also possible that a moral choice on a short scale or in a direct scale is a poor choice in a more larger context. The point that I'm bringing up here has to do with the situation and the crisis at the border. Right now, the United States has taken all sorts of provocative action over the last 50, 100 years, where South America is supposed to be our playground. We consider that our domain of influence, despite the fact that other people live there, that those people want to have self-determination every bit as much as we want to have self-determination, and yet it is denied from them. You had Lula being put in a cage with the CIA apparently working with the British government, at least based on the information that's been released, to effect that. He was a troublesome lefty. And the Workers' Party, if they got in office, was not going to necessarily be a patsy Brazil. They were going to have a sense of sovereignty. Same thing is true with Evo Morales. Evo Morales wins by 10 points. They tried to put him in a cage, or for that matter, try to have him whacked. He ends up leaving the country, and because of what seems to be the U.S. influence in that coup, you have this weird situation where the U.S. media doesn't want to call a coup, and furthermore, when they take steps to remedy the fact that there was a coup, turns around and says, Bolivia is taking a turn to authoritarianism. You people are insane. That point of view is warped. Even going to this thing of, the other countries in the region. Honduras, for example, where Zelaya was taken out in a coup with Hillary Clinton, who basically didn't allow him to come back in, worked with the next government that was illegitimate. That country becomes a basket case. 80% of the cocaine that's shipped through South America ends up through Honduras. And that coup did not work out well for us, if indeed the point was to not have cocaine shoved into the nose of every quote-unquote gringo. The honest truth of it is we're going to ever have an honest, substantive conversation about the South, we have to come to some conclusions about our influence in that South, as opposed to continuously dropping the context when we talk about the issue. Hey, all of these people weirdly and magically showed up at the border. Let's drop the context of, let's say, the amount of drugs that we use in this country, the stress, the depravity, the not having your ends. That stuff produces and promotes a certain degree of mental let's say, destabilization, the individual has a difficult time pursuing, and oftentimes drugs, suicide, self-harm, etc., etc. In order to supply that appetite, you have South America. And because of our drug laws, you either have gangs that meet up in order to accommodate that need, or you have situations where various states subversively accommodate that need, in the case of like Honduras. But more importantly, the drug laws that we have in this country, our own agents and the DEA and all that stuff and the policies that we have in those countries, we set those countries on fire, incidentally, but also directly through the coups that we propagate. Jen Psaki one time made the point of saying we learn from our mistakes. Do we? I mean, and do we even acknowledge it as a mistake? And if the mainstream media, when we talk about it, drops the context of what took place prior, then how could we ever really hit it as an honest to God failure and make adjustments for it later when we can't even acknowledge that it was a failure, or for that matter, the boundaries of conversation doesn't even include that context? South America is not a basket case just because the people are somehow incapable of stabilizing their governments. It's a basket case because we've taken one provocative action after the next to make it such. The coups that we have pushed forth just in the last 10 years are profound. Putting Lula in a cage is profound. 300,000 people are on the docket to die in Brazil. Would that have been true if Lula was in office? No. Would Lula have accepted the vaccine from either Russia or China in order to accommodate his people so they wouldn't be dying of this illness? Most likely, yes. He probably wouldn't have accepted the United States pushing him and forcing him to take a policy that was going to injure and kill Brazilians in the way that Bolsonaro took that policy. At the very least, that's bragged by the Health and Human Services report, where we basically pushed those guys not to use the vaccines from China and Russia. This is utterly astonishing that the Brazilian life mattered less than U.S. foreign policy interests. That would have not been true under a president or under a prime minister or under a leader that had a sense of sovereignty. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. Correa, where they tried to put an arrest warrant on him, that was the gentleman who understood, again, sovereignty issues, would not give Julian Assange up, gave Julian Assange asylum. They tried to put him in a cage. The South has been under siege by U.S. imperialist interests. That's the point that I'm trying to make. But the media can't talk about it like that. So the context is always dropped. If you were going to make a quote unquote moral choice, the moral choice, yes, you could say at the very end of the decision space with all of these poor decisions, and the moral choice at the very end of that is to basically allow the kids in. That's one frame of thought. But another frame of thought is that if you have created all of those fires and you now take a policy that is going to bring people to the border, whether you tell them to come or not, if you're incentivizing it, you're basically sending an invite. And the change of policy that Biden accommodated or Biden took over created an incentive for people to come. Now, the question is it still a moral choice if you have a quagmire at the border where either you have the potential of spreading COVID or, for that matter, just a large number of kids that are in custody without relatives and parents? Is it still a moral choice? I understand the objective, but at the end, is it correct? There's a difference in those things. What you want as an intention is somewhat different than the outcome of those actions. Let's play the first clip. Jen Psaki is trying to make the argument that the border is not a crisis. Jen Psaki is insane. The border is exactly a crisis. And that level of thick propaganda may work for the dim bulbs that tend to call themselves the White House press corps. Not here on Fault Lines. Let's play this clip.
Children presenting at our border who are fleeing violence, who are fleeing prosecution, who are fleeing terrible situations is not a crisis. We feel that it is our responsibility to humanely approach this circumstance and make sure they are treated and put in conditions that are safe. I will say that these photos show what we've long been saying, which is that these Border Patrol facilities are not places made for children. They are not places that we want children to be staying for an extended period of time. Our alternative is to send children back on this treacherous journey. That is not, in our view, the right choice to make.
Well, there's also the situation of, not taking a foreign policy that sets the countries on fire, where the people would have to take the treacherous journey in the first place to put their kids here. There's that. There's also maybe not necessarily immediately rolling back a particular policy that was going to clearly incentivize people to come, or at the very least to bring their kids. And again, for whatever particular reason, she has this belief that just because you take what you consider to be a good act, that there wouldn't necessarily be negative consequences for that good act. That's magic. That's not reality. Reality is based on the notion of cause and effect, and that cause and effect does not necessarily have to live to your best outcome ideas. Reality does not care about your ideology. Let's play the last one. This one is funny to me because for all of the hand-wringing and consternation that took place when Republicans and Donald Trump was in office, AOC crying at the border. Well, at this point, Democrats now are annoyed that so much attention is being placed on the border. And so they keep asking, when is Joe Biden going to go visit the border? Kamala Harris gives a heartfelt talk about the people at the border, about the pain and the angst of the migrants there. But then she's immediately, almost on a dime, asked, are you going to go to the border? And listen to this. This is what she says.
Do you plan to visit the border?
Not today. But I have before, and I'm sure I will again.
Hell no, I ain't visiting no border. You got all those migrants at that border. Look at all those kids. They got those sticky fingers. And then they sometimes like to touch you with those sticky fingers. And all of those kids are crying. You got kids laying on the floor. It's packed. Oh, I'm not going to no border. Are you crazy? Huh. But I have been before. And I may go back again. That doesn't look good. That weird laughter doesn't look good. I guess I'm making the point that you guys started a crisis at the border. And in turn of starting that crisis at the border, now you don't want to talk about it. And you're trying to basically make amends for the crisis at the border that you created. They keep asking you, are you going? That is like the worst reply ever. Just because you do good doesn't mean as a flat, fat good will follow, or at the very least the outcome of that would be good. And in this case, I understand that they believe they're taking an ethical choice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the border is not a crisis. It is indeed a disaster. Shane, what are your thoughts?
It is a crisis and it is a disaster. And she sounded nervous. I mean, we were talking about this in the pre-show meeting this morning, but she sounded nervous when she said that. She doesn't know how to handle this. I don't think Biden does. I don't think any of them do. I want to come back to the Monroe Doctrine thing for just a second, because again, that's the secret root of a lot of this stuff. We have continuously overthrown government after government whose policies we didn't like. And I'm racking my brain. That made some sense, I guess, in the Cold War, when there was a clear ideological competition between the United States on the one side and the USSR on the other. And there was an ideological competition between capitalism and socialism and whatnot. I don't get where that's gone in the 21st century. We're a pretty socialistic government ourselves at this point. Some would say not enough, but regardless, we've walked down that road a decent ways, to the chagrin of many Republicans, to the shame of many Republicans. But still, what are we actually fighting down there? It seems, I guess the simplest answer, but even this still feels a little bit incomplete to me, is that we're fighting the loss of some control. We're fighting the loss, not of any ideological victory, but just purely materially of being able to control what different countries do down there with their resources and their citizens and, their laws, their policies, all that stuff. But what I'm worried about here is I can understand, okay, somebody's sitting in Washington and they look down south and they see a chance to save American lives, not directly maybe, but they think to themselves, if I can overthrow this country, if if we can dress it up, and these would not maybe be the exact words they're thinking, but we can dress it up as a humanitarian intervention, and in the process get rid of a leader we don't want, then maybe we can forestall some American loss of control in this territory, American loss of hegemony for a generation maybe. But what I don't see is how they don't see that a couple generations down the line, and maybe sooner than that, we will lose that control and there will be a massive backlash. And I'm worried that we're accelerating the rate of that loss by trying to hold on with every last desperate white knuckle grip we can, to that thin ledge of control we still have over the world. And I do believe that, to some extent militarily we still have it. But I'm worried that the leaders in charge are not aware of how quickly they're losing it and how the decisions they're making to save on losing it are actually accelerating that loss. But we got to go into a break. We'll be back talking about events in the UK and the trial of the politician Craig Murray with our next guest, Alexander Mercouris. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we cover world politics, of course, but definitely politics across the pond. One of the interesting cases that have been taking place had to do with the Alex Salmond trial. Now, this trial has all sorts of consequences associated with it, but one of those consequences has to do with Craig Murray, former Scottish diplomat, who is at this point facing imprisonment for basically a blog that he wrote about, let's say, piecing together who the women were that were involved in that trial. Now, this creates a contempt case, and Craig Murray just basically lost that contempt case, and as such is facing prison time. Now, Murray's defense on this, they're preparing the case for the Supreme Court. But Murray basically argued that the information that was published on the blog could have led to the identification, but that's the charges against him, that they could have led to the identification. But Murray's point is, I knew who they were, I pieced them together, and if I wanted to disclose it, I could have disclosed it. He also kind of makes the point that he was contacted about this, and if it was something that was that pressing of an issue, then they shouldn't have let the trial go forward if it indeed was. In order to have a conversation about this and the outcome of this, because this is actually quite interesting. I mean, Murray, to my mind, has a point, and it would be a travesty of justice if they put him in a cage over a blog post. Joining us to discuss is Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. Alexander, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be with you again.
Absolutely. Did I explain that properly? And is there any other additional context you want to add to it? I just wanted to give a brief overview so people can understand it.
I think you explained it very well. I have to declare an interest. I know Craig Murray personally, and I am his friend. So obviously I have particular feelings about this case. I don't want to see him sent to prison. I don't want him to be found guilty because he is my friend. But putting that aside, I think you've pinpointed the key facts about this. Firstly, I think it's absolutely the case that if there had been serious concerns about what he was writing on his blog, it would have been perfectly possible for the Scottish authorities to ask him to desist from doing so, and when he didn't, to go ahead and take steps to prevent him doing so. I think leaving him in a position where he goes on writing on his blog to the point where they allege that he has committed a crime and then prosecute him for it, I think that is an extremely disturbing thing. That's the first point. The second is about the jigsaw identification of the witnesses. I'm not convinced there was, in the sense that I suspect that anybody who was able to piece together from Craig Murray's comments who these witnesses were almost certainly would have known who they were previously. And in fact, much has already been written in other Scottish newspapers and indeed in the British media generally, which would have identified these witnesses more easily than anything that Craig Murray himself wrote. So I think if this decision is as we are told, and I would say, by the way, that though I'm sure that he has been convicted, and there are reasons why I think he has been convicted, we won't actually get the decision, the formal decision, until tomorrow. But if he has been convicted, I do hope that he does take it to the appeal courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court in London, if it comes to that. And I do hope that it's overturned there. I would add that in the United States, where the media is protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution, Craig Murray, as a journalist, would not be in the kind of jeopardy he is in Britain because of what he wrote. In the United States, it would not be an issue. He would have committed no crime, and no one would have claimed that he did.
Do you think Craig Murray is expected to stand for Parliament? Do you think that has something to do with the charges? Meaning, do you think is there any way that this is politically motivated?
Right, well, we now come to the whole political issue, because, of course, this is a highly political case, as the Alex Salmond whole case from which it originates is also political. Now, I'm going to say a few things, and I have to be extremely careful what I'm going to say here. Firstly, there is a claim which originates with Alex Salmond that the allegations against him, the original allegations, were orchestrated and were politically motivated. No one has looked into that. There is no view taken by anyone in authority after a proper investigation as to whether or not that is true. Now, I don't know whether it's true or not, but what does concern me is that ever since Alex Salmond was acquitted in that trial, where he faced those allegations a few weeks ago, there has been a sustained practice in the media and in the Scottish Parliament and on the part of certain politicians to assume that Salmond was in some way falsely acquitted and that the original allegations were true. I say that because there's been this constant drumbeat that it is the people who were his accusers in the case who are the actual victims in the Salmond case. Now, I don't know that is so. And what that has led to, it seems to me, is a series of further cases, one against Craig Murray specifically himself, one in this investigation that's taken place by this Irish lawyer, Mr. Hamilton, the other the Scottish Parliament investigation, all of which seem to be based on the presumption that the allegations, the original allegations against Salmond, which a jury cleared him of, were in some way true. And I can't help but feel that that does open up at least a sentiment that this is some kind of political reckoning with people who are considered embarrassing to the Scottish establishment, people like Salmond and people like Murray being cleared out of the way and steps being taken to ensure that their political careers, such as they are, don't resume or flourish. That's certainly the case in Salmond's case. It seems to be the case in Murray's case also.
The election for
Thank you, Alexander. Two follow-up questions here. One, you say that they could be seen as embarrassing by the establishment. I want you to get it a little bit more into why, what fissure exactly divides them, what on policy grounds, historically, just bringing it to an American audience who I'm not that familiar with either of these political figures, and I'm relatively new to Scottish politics. So specifically Salmond, it would be good to know more about. And then additionally, the coincidence of, it seems, the media, the judicial system, the coincidence of their actions following the technical acquittal of Salmond, all nevertheless, sprouting up new cases like you're talking about. Is there enough evidence to allege a conspiracy on the back end at this point, or would that be pure rank speculation? Alexander?
There is no evidence to allege a conspiracy. There is just coincidence, which of course leads many people, a great many people, to draw inferences, not perhaps of a conspiracy, but shall we say of a degree of orchestration. I want to stress again, I do not know whether that is the case, and I will say straight away also that that there is no evidence of that. It's just a question of the timing. But some people do find the timing interesting. I have to be careful what I say. I think you will understand why. There are contempt of court laws here in Britain, of which Murray has been caught up in one. Now, in relation to salmon and sturgeon, Salmond is definitely to the left of sturgeon. I don't think anybody who knows the two carefully and hasn't watched their politics carefully would dispute that. Salmond is a much more fiery and abrasive character than Sturgeon is, and he is probably someone who most people would think would pursue the cause of Scottish independence more forcefully, aggressively even, than Sturgeon would. Also, Salmond is persona non grata in London, whereas Sturgeon is actually got many fans in London, partly because she is seen as a more emollient character. Last but not least, Salmond has a program on RT and is seen as pro-Russian, which is, of course, completely unacceptable to the political class in London. So there are all those factors in play, which means that London, the establishment in London, and to a certain extent, the establishment in Edinburgh, would not be happy to see Salmond back. They would be worried that if Salmond were to win what is now increasingly looking like a power struggle within the SNP, he would take it in a more radical direction, both a more left-wing direction and a more pro-independence direction and a more pro-Russian direction, and might lead an independent Scotland into a more pro-Russian direction. So that is the stakes at play here. The establishment in London does not want to see the United Kingdom break up. I think they feel that an SNP led by Alex Salmond, who was the person who led the SNP to its great electoral breakthroughs, is a much greater threat to achieve that than an SNP led by Nicola Sturgeon. I hope I've explained it well, or sufficiently.
Absolutely. You know what? We're about out of time here, so I'm going to take us to a very slightly early break. But Alexander, that was fantastic. I want to come back. We're going to get back into Craig Murray, back into this story. I also want to follow up going into Turkey and some recent news, how they're relating to the EU, pulling out of deals, prosecuting soldiers at home. But nevertheless, we'll have to come back on the other side of this break. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris. He's the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow Alexander on YouTube on his channel, Alexander Mercouris. You can also watch The Duran on YouTube, and you should check out their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Alexander on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak: The Deadliest Epidemics in Human History, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by our guest, Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can also follow Alexander on YouTube on his channel, Alexander Mercouris, and watch The Duran on YouTube, and check out their website, theduran.com. Alexander, thank you again for being with us. Let's keep this conversation going. We were talking on the other side. I'd asked you about what exactly is the vital distinction here. Why would the Scottish establishment be embarrassed by or want to push away from Alex Salmond? Let's turn to Craig Murray, because you included him in that list. Craig Murray, currently facing contempt of court charges, and the final decision will be made tomorrow and made public, and we'll be coming back on it then. But let's be specific here. If there was a politically driven attempt, and on some level it seems like there 100% is, but I'm not alleging a conspiracy or anything specific. I'm just saying it seems that politics are involved. What would it be driven by? Why would people not like Craig Murray?
Well, I think before we talk about that, I would just make one very quick point, that a decision was taken to prosecute Craig Murray for contempt of court charges. Given that Alex Salmond was acquitted and cleared, it is somewhat strange to me that decision to prosecute Craig Murray was taken, and I wonder why it was done. Now, I say that, that's all I'm going to say about that, because for the reasons I explained earlier, there are contempt of court laws here. But why would people want to see Craig Murray out of the way? Craig Murray is a thorn in the side both of the British establishment and of the Scottish establishment. He has an extremely successful blog here. It is read by hundreds of thousands of people. His views are distributed and are widely known around the world, and there is a great deal of interest in all the things that he says. So from that point of view, Craig Murray is a thorn in the side. He is very left-wing. He's politically radical, and he is a strong supporter in Scotland of an independent Scotland, and has been a long-time critic of Nicola Sturgeon, who he believes has been far too conciliatory and willing to work with London. So this is a reason why people in Scotland would disapprove of him. The establishment in Scotland might disapprove of him. And in London, of course, the entire political establishment in London detests him, because he is somebody who exposes corruption, who has left-wing views, who opposes all the regime change wars, who exposed torture, the practice of torture, and gave up a successful Foreign Office career in order to do that. He is very widely disliked by the British establishment in London.
Very interesting. I want to pivot a bit to move on to Turkey. Erdogan basically had a roundup recently. Now, there is a Muslim cleric named Fethullah Gulen, who basically is being accused of backing the coup back in 2016. In fact, they're saying that he was behind the coup in 2016. And this led to all sorts of purges and all sorts of arrests. If I'm not mistaken, like thousands of people were arrested and rounded up as a result of being associated with the coup. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, Erdogan has been getting quite much news recently, pulling out of a women's treaty with the EU, basically shoring up his hardline base. And now you have this situation, basically, and I'm going to read it. Erdogan, this is RT. Erdogan and his government has maintained that Gulen, who has lived in self-exile in the United States since 1999, orchestrated the 2016 attempted coup that resulted in the deaths of 251 people, the injury of 2,734. Gulen has basically said that that's not true, that he's denied any involvement. Frame this for us, because whether it's true or not, Erdogan did use this for political power and basically to strengthen his grip on political power. So much so, there were questions about whether or not it was basically a false flag operation. So, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely.
On this? Yeah.
I mean, I should say I don't think it was a false flag. I mean, I think it was entirely genuine coup. But what role Gulen actually had in it is an entirely different matter. Now, Erdogan at the moment is under intense political pressure. Support for him in the big cities in Turkey, in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Izmir, in those sort of places is slipping because of major problems in the economy. There is very high inflation. The lira is coming under increasing pressure. The country has essentially no forex reserves in its central bank. And of course, Erdogan himself insists on pursuing a unusual interest rate policy in which he opposes any attempt to increase interest rates. He's been pursuing, in effect, a policy of growth at all costs. And of course, it is creating more and more problems in Turkey itself. So his response always in these kind of situations is to tighten control within Turkey. And he does that by invoking this scarecrow of Gulen back in the United States, who he says was behind the 2016 coup, who he portrays as a plotter and as a conspirator, and everybody who ends up opposing Erdogan, whoever they are, for whatever reason, it seems is somehow linked to Gulen, at least in Erdogan's terms. So even the people, for example, who assassinated the Russian ambassador a few years ago, they too, it is now being alleged, were somehow involved in Gulen's network. I'm going to just add one thing about Gulen. Gulen is, of course, somebody who is connected to the United States. And there have been articles in the Turkish media at various times which suggest that Gulen has connections with the United States intelligence services, with the CIA and the rest. So when Erdogan goes after people claiming that they are connected with Gulen, it is to some extent code for suggesting that they are in fact connected to the CIA, to US intelligence, and that they're part of a US regime change operation directed at Erdogan himself. Now, I have no idea whether that is true or not. I strongly doubt it, by the way. But it is a trope that Erdogan plays because he knows that it is one that carries considerable traction in Turkey, where the United States has had a long history of involvement in Turkish domestic politics and in backing various Turkish coups.
And one other aspect of this that it's good to bring up, probably, Gulen, the leader of a movement called a terrorist movement by the Turkish government, first and foremost. And it seems like whether there is or isn't a connection between him and what happened with the coup, he is a useful figure to levy accusations against. I want to turn to the last thing that you said. I'll throw in one other thing first that I want to get your take on. It also seems like this ties into the Kurds, because Gulen is like an Anatolian pan-ethnicist. In other words, trying to tie different ethnic groups residing in the region into a larger whole. And he was influenced by Kurdish thinkers and scholars. And of course, Erdogan is currently fighting a war against the Kurds and has been for years. I'm guessing that would play into it. So whether you take it up on that angle or whether you continue, and I'd be very curious to hear, has this been portrayed, the coup been portrayed in Turkish media, either in hints or in outright speech, explicit speech, as an attempt by the United States intelligence community to overthrow Erdogan? Is that being treated as such in Turkey, Alexander?
Well, a lot of people in Turkey think that, and articles have appeared in the Turkish media would say that. And Erdogan himself has at various times dropped hints that that's what he thinks. He's never actually come out straightforwardly and said so. And there's been a lot of pushback from the US itself denying that that is the case. They deny emphatically that they were involved in the 2016 coup. And by the way, for various reasons, which I'm not going to discuss now, I believe the US on this. I don't think the US was directly involved with the coup. Now, Erdogan has increasingly evolved as his time in, leader of Turkey has continued, into two things. Obviously, he is an Islamist leader, but he is increasingly also a Turkish nationalist. This wasn't something he always started as, but he is increasingly a Turkish ethnic nationalist, as well as an Islamist leader. That sets him increasingly in opposition to the Kurds. And there were previous criticisms of Erdogan that he had been too accommodating to the Kurds. And this is one of the things that drove opposition to him, which led to the coup. That is something that he doesn't want. This idea that he's soft on the Kurds is not something that he wants people to think anymore. And that does undoubtedly set him against Gulen, but it also means that by attacking Gulen, he is able to say to Turkish people, to people within Turkey, Gulen is really the CIA. The CIA is backing the Kurds. It's backing the Kurds in Syria, in Iraq, and other places. And this is all a conspiracy, ultimately, not just against me, but against Turkey also, and against the unity of Turkey and its integrity as a nation. And that is a powerful mix of tropes and memes that Erdogan is able to deploy in Turkey itself. And there is no doubt at all that they carry a lot of traction with many people. People always underestimate Erdogan's political skills and his ability to mobilize large sections of the Turkish electorate and population behind his policies.
Is there any real opposition to Erdogan in Turkey at this point? I'm just curious.
Yes,
I mean, he seems to be such a dominant political figure.
He is a dominant political figure. There is an awful lot of disagreement with him. There's an awful lot of opposition to him. And there is opposition, as I said, increasingly in the big cities and, of course, in the Kurdish regions. The trouble is that opposition is divided and fragmented, and it has not coalesced around a single particular individual. Also, one of the main critical parts of this coalition, and the one which arguably has the most articulate and forceful spokespeople and political leaders, is the Kurdish bloc, which, of course, in a way, plays into Erdogan's hands. He could say that his opponents are also part of this conspiracy to break up Turkey, to threaten Turkey's unity, because they are associated and connected to the Kurds in certain ways. So despite the fact that there is a lot of criticism of Erdogan, despite the fact the economy is not doing well, despite the fact that middle-class living standards are falling and have been falling for a while, and despite the fact that many Turks are very skeptical of the foreign adventures that Erdogan commits Turkey to, I think that his position at the moment and for the time being remains secure, because though there is a lot of opposition to him, it has not achieved critical mass, and it has not.
And it's divided. Alexander, we've got to close very shortly here in like 5 or 10 seconds. I've got to keep this quick. What support does Gulen have in Turkey?
I don't think very much. I think Gulen is entirely a person who built up establishment networks within the Turkish elite, and I think Erdogan has smashed them. I don't think he has any.
So he would have had political connections, but not wide demographic support from the Turkish public, and therefore he's a useful boogeyman because people know about him, but there's not that much support for him, frankly. So he's not alienating that much of the Turkish public. There are other aspects of this that we should come back to at some other time. Great conversation this morning, Alex. Thank you for joining us. We were joined by Alexander Mercouris. You can follow him as editor-in-chief at theduran.com. Watch Alexander on YouTube, on his channel, Alexander Mercouris. Also watch The Duran on YouTube and check out their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines in another 2 hours of this morning's show.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant political analyst, Jamaro Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 892 new coronavirus deaths and 58,764 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 54,810 cases per day, a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,957,300 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 543,000 have died from it. This puts me in mind, there's a Twilight Zone episode where all of these people, Twilight Zone was so good, but they were talking about all of these people like walking. It was a long road, and one woman was sitting on a porch as these people walked by, and she's waiting for her husband. And the last person she sees is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln is like, there's nobody else behind me. We might as well keep going. The woman was dead. It was the Civil War. And all of those people were basically following the Civil War. And Abraham Lincoln was the last one to die in that war. And it's like the futility of being the last person to die in a conflict. It kind of feels like that. When you get to the point of like having this number go down and you get 550,000 people, 550,000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, going through. Those last few numbers just seems that much worse almost just because of the way the virus is ending and they're catching it at the very end. I don't know. That was just the way it felt. Vladimir Putin has been vaccinated against COVID-19. The Kremlin does not specify which vaccine Putin received. The aim was to underline, quote, all 3 Russian vaccines are absolutely reliable, very good, and effective, unquote. The vaccination was not lively publicized, and when asked if people would believe Putin actually received the shot, spokesman Dmitry Peskov said people would just have to, quote, take our word for it, unquote. Why wouldn't he receive the vaccine? It would be weird if he didn't. Also, just to criticize a little bit, the Sputnik V vaccine, it's a satellite that you guys put into space. That first thing that shocked the conscience of the world in regards to the Soviets in space. That should have been the vaccine. That's where I'm at. That's where I'm standing. That's a show network decision. Fair enough. But I'm standing by it. I think Shane will back me up on it. Employers such as Target, Trader Joe's, McDonald's, Dollar General are among a growing list of companies giving workers time off and extra money to get vaccinated for COVID-19. Krispy Kreme Donuts is offering anyone with proof of COVID vaccination a free donut. A marijuana dispensary in Walled Lake, Michigan is giving anyone over 21 with proof of vaccination a free pre-rolled joint. Good for you. Good for you. According to a report by the Society for Human Resource Management, nearly 1/4 of employed Americans who won't get vaccinated, would consider getting the shot if offered cash or a stipend. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad? Is that free? And think about what I'm asking for the moment. The people who basically would be hesitant to get the vaccine, they're saying, I don't want to do it. The moment that you add a little bit of cash or a little bit of a stipend, their physical needs are such that they are inclined, incentivized even, to take a vaccine to which they are dodgy about. Now, my issue here is not whether the vaccine is efficient or not. The issue here is what's in their heads. And what's in their heads is a certain degree of concern about the vaccine for whatever particular reason, be it valid or not. In this very specific case, though, I'm making the point that a free choice in that would be one where they could say, I don't need the money. I'm not going to do the vaccine because it bothers me. But that's not what's taking place. That is fascinating. And it bespeaks of people not necessarily having enough resources where they can make those choices. I keep saying freedom requires all sorts of constituent items. The freedom to die on the street without health care is a freedom. Is it really one that you want? No, there's all sorts of things that are constituents that people need in order to get to the point of even having an intellectual capacity to look around, to understand their world, process their world, and pursue their aims in a way that will make sense to themselves contextually. And if people are not taught those things, it cripples that person as that person gets older. And I would even argue that on some level we do that intentionally in order to make people better robots, less thinkers. I do want to give a shout out to the dispensary though. And I want to point out that apparently because marijuana has some kind of positive effects against preventing COVID, that they may be doing a double shot to prevent those people from getting COVID. So this is like a health thing twice over. Not only are you getting the vaccination, but you're also getting that joint dose that would also help prevent COVID. Shout out to Michigan. Good job, Michigan. You're doing God's work. God's work. Krispy Kreme, not so much. Those things are fattening. But Michigan, good job. Countries across the globe took to the streets last weekend to demand an end to the government's coronavirus regulations, marking the first anniversary of coronavirus lockdowns in several nations. Participant in the, quote, worldwide rally for freedom, unquote, marched in Canada, the United States, Uruguay, Argentina, Ireland, Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands. This also includes France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Croatia, Serbia, Ukraine, Japan, and Australia, among other nations, to protest lockdowns, mask mandates, and the promotion of COVID-19 vaccines. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said Tuesday that the coronavirus infections are rising too fast to allow relaxation of the country's tough lockdown, and instead extended it for a further 3 weeks. This comes after Germany also extended its lockdown for more time. This is going to be bad. Shane, this is a recipe for disaster. Now, the U.S. under Biden had one job, basically do the vaccine rollout and nail it. That's his one job. Donald Trump's job was to basically deal with the virus, to which he did by setting 500,000 people on fire. Biden's job is slightly easier. He just needs to be relatively competent in order to let people, the logistics work out. In the cases around the globe, apparently in Europe, they screwed up their rollout. And so you have, like we were talking to, I think it was, I forget the gentleman who we were talking about it, but basically the worst of both worlds. I think Alexander at one point, where you have a vaccine rollout. The vaccine rollout doesn't entirely work all that well. It doesn't get to the number of people who it needs to get to. And then you have this kind of weird vaccine nationalism where, you know, there are threats of maintaining or keeping the vaccines in the various countries. Like all of this stuff is taking place. And then you have AstraZeneca get hit with a thing saying that they dodged or they basically committed some level of fraud. At least that's what the United States is claiming. Not to mention the blood clot thing. It was botched on so many levels. And so it's like, this is like the worst case scenario. And so in their heads, it's like, all right, the arrow that we have in our quiver, lock it down. And at this point, people are sick of it. It's been a year. The vaccines are out. They're aggravated that the vaccines are out, and yet they're not necessarily able to get access to the vaccines in a way where they can go back and pursue their world. And I keep saying, I've said it more than once. I said this months ago. The moment that the number of people who are vaccinated get to this kind of parity of sorts, meaning the more people that get vaccinated, the less or the more conflict you're going to have if you try to keep those regulations in place, like lockdowns and everything else. You will get the public to agree with you, providing that the public believes there's a shared interest in them getting sick. When you get more people vaccinated, they're not going to want to deal with the mask. They're not going to deal with the lockdowns. It's a recipe for disaster. What's your thought, Shane?
Agreed. Yes, agreed. Simply. Feel free to get back into the headlines, man.
Fair enough. Yeah, straight agreement. Fair enough.
You went.
No, I'm here.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think it's a big deal. And I think we're going to start seeing that. And the question is, how destabilizing is that to the various countries, to the point where all those countries are going to have to do something different in order to respond to the lockdowns? I'm curious on how long they're going to be able to maintain that. U.S. President Joe Biden will join a video summit of the European Union leaders on Thursday to discuss improving transatlantic cooperation. The 27 EU leaders have a regular two-day summit starting Thursday, where they will discuss everything from vaccine strategy to relations with Russia. A phone call between Biden and the EU Commission President Ursula von von der Leyen, clinched a trade breakthrough with a 4-month suspension of tariffs used for long-standing Airbus-Boeing dispute. The dispute stems from the European Union and the United States claiming that each other's airplane manufacturer is unfairly subsidized. Well, I would say one airplane manufacturer has all sorts of problems having their planes falling out the sky because they're making decisions based on profit and not necessarily decisions based on the best case engineering for that particular firm. But yeah, totally, tariffs back and forth. Both of those companies probably being subsidized, and yet they're throwing this dispersion back and forth. Puerto Rico has granted immediate access to $912 million in federal funds that had not been available to students in public and private universities and public and private schools on the island as a result of restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona announced Monday. The new funds come less than 2 weeks after Puerto Rico reopened dozens of public and private schools for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic began. New York saw several different protests over the weekend as residents took part in the, quote, Tax the Rich March, and also attended dueling rallies against and in support of Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has come under fire in his response to COVID-19, as well as the string of sexual harassment allegations. Hiding the number of people that are dead in nursing homes tends to put people off in a way that they may want to hold you accountable. They frown upon that, just in general. Russia's foreign envoy, Sergei Lavrov, said that relations between the European Union and Russia had been destroyed unilaterally by decisions made in Brussels, saying that Russia no longer have relations with the European Union after Brussels, quote, destroyed them, unquote, but we're willing to come back to the table with the EU if and when the bloc is ready to remove this anomaly in relations. This came during a conversation in Beijing with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, during which both of them called the latest batch of sanctions against the two countries interference. On some level it is, right? You're interfering into the foreign affairs and the politics of those, or the domestic politics of those nations. What do you think, Shane? I mean, we've been sanctioning the world at this point. I don't necessarily see how those sanctions are all that beneficial. We're basically saying that China is committing genocide despite the fact that we're working with them. They're our third largest trading partner. And like I said, Biden said he's going to work with these guys despite that fact. The evidence is lacking for that, and yet that's their aspersion, that's their claim. I'm making the point of how disgusting that claim is, especially if you can't back that claim up. From the standpoint of Russia, they're basically saying that God-man Putin has his hand on basically everything around the world, and that the sanctions in this case are necessary, especially for the ones for Navalny, which if a country sanctioned us over our domestic politics, we would take great issue with that. Not to mention having friends like MBS and then pointing the finger at other nations. So yeah, I don't necessarily think they're all that wrong in saying that. I do think, however, that we are in a weird spot that is not to our benefit. And even from the standpoint of the European Union, Russia and China are two global dominant forces in the world right now. And pushing the two countries together is basically what the United States and the European Union has been doing in this kind of alienation, just rank attacks. It seems that the European Union and the United States has a certain degree of fear and consternation and worry about the two nations and decided to handle that in this kind of weird zero-sum match as opposed to trying to find win-win solutions. Win-win is off the table. That said, is that in the best interest of the European Union, regardless of what tack the United States takes? I don't necessarily think it is. And Russia making the point that you guys are losing us or lost us as a partner gets that point across. They're not waiting on the European Union. That's the point that I'm making here. They're finding and forging relationships elsewhere without them. What are your thoughts, Shane?
I think that our reliance on sanctions, and I'm speaking principally about the United States, although this could be applied more widely to other, members of the West, including the European Union at this point, our reliance on sanctions shows that we lack the ability to pursue diplomacy effectively by other means, e.g., actually diplomacy. We're not trying to broker deals with other countries in some sort of meaningful, long-term constructive process. We've resorted to throwing paper at people and hoping that it cuts them. And more often than not, it doesn't really cut them. It doesn't really get get the job done. But yeah, another way of looking at sanctions is they're the lazy, easy resort for leaders who don't know how to have difficult conversations over the course of years with the leaders of other countries. That's one take on them that I haven't heard too many people say, but that's my take.
Yeah, I can't see how the take is wrong. Basically, we're going to use sanctions in lieu of diplomacy. And, you know, there's something else about sanctions. They're an act of war. And the paper cuts oftentimes aren't hitting the people that they're talking about hitting. What happens is it hits the population. Like 500,000 kids died in those sanctions put on Iraq. How many people died in those sanctions put on for Venezuela and Iran that prevented them from even getting meds that were necessary for like COVID and those type of things? So let's be very clear. The sanctions are not innocuous. I'm not saying you are, Shane. I'm just saying sometimes Americans think
no. And you're right. Here's the thing, though. They've gotten more innocuous over time because instead of doing flat sanctions against countries, which are they're, you know, collective punishment, they're too broad to effectively get, you know, if they were seen transparently by the American publics and by the publics of other countries in the West, if they were seen transparently for what they are, we would see them as human rights abuses. What I'm talking about more recently are the Magnitsky-style sanctions leveled against individuals arbitrarily accused of any abuse de jure, any abuse, you know, any human rights abuse that we see fit to deem worthy of sanctioning, despite all of our human rights abuses, despite how so many of our wars, our engagements overseas and at home could have the exact same complaints leveled at them. I would, you know, like we had that conversation with Mark Sloboda the other day. He said that most of the Russian officials who, you know, ran the risk of facing Magnitsky-style sanctions effectively saw them as a joke. They didn't have assets. They didn't have assets in the United States. They weren't planning on visiting Disneyland or going vacationing in America. So they don't exactly apply. We need to go to a break, though. We're running a little bit long on headlines. You guys have been listening to Headlines. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back in a minute on the other side of this short break with our next guest, Lee Stranahan. Be right back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking about Russiagate, Natalia Veselnitskaya, an infamous meeting at the Trump Tower, Bill Browder, and new allegations coming out from the Daily Beast linking Sergei Magnitsky, the late Sergei Magnitsky, and Bill Browder, his employer, to a chemical weapons program that the Daily Beast is trying to link to Russia and Navalny. For this conversation, to go over what's being said here, what's driving it, the backstory, the history, we're joined by the host of The Backstory, Lee Stranahan. He's a Sputnik news analyst, host of The Backstory. That's a show airing here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. And both my dad and the previous host of this show. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Well, that's a complex question, but, you know, I'm here.
Good to hear.
As we talked about last time, I'm going through some health issues. So how I'm doing any given moment is, you know, tricky.
It varies. And how,
yeah.
I mean, let's just get into the health issues for just a second at the very least. You went to the hospital a couple of weeks ago. You've been recovering decently. Now there are eye problems this week. I don't need to go into the whole thing. But for folks who are listening, last time we had you on, that was the story. And you know, we spoke last night. I'm glad to hear you're doing okay, all things considered. But dispiriting news that you're having to deal with this week.
Yeah, and some of it's not even related to ongoing. Like this thing with my eye seems to be related to a childhood accident I had. And the weird part is, I'll do the very short version. The very very short version is, I'm going in Friday and they're injecting my eye.
That's what it was. I was trying to figure out exactly where they would be injecting, and they are injecting your eye. That is horrifying.
Right? Does that sound fun, Jamal? As soon as they talk about injecting your eye,
yeah, that's not sexy. That's not
right.
sexy.
No, thanks. Yeah, no, it's bad. But apparently I've got some eye problems, and then I also apparently I got a flu vaccine when I was in the hospital, and apparently it didn't help because I seem to have a bout of the flu. I've been, coughing up fluids and stuff. Anyway, I'm just a mess. But here I am, and the news continues. Yeah, well, it's no fun.
No, the news doesn't stop. And no, if I had known you were feeling this bad, I might not wanted to bring you on just so you could get some more rest. But I thought of you because you're the guy that I would go to on this. We've been talking about Bill Browder. You and I have been talking about Bill Browder for years. We've been talking on this show, starting with you, also for years. And I know you know this story. And I'm guessing we haven't really talked in depth about this new article from the Daily Beast. Title of the article, by the way, is Veselnitskaya's Trump Tower cover-up linked to secret Russian chemical weapons program, quote unquote. That sounds pretty scandalous. And it seems to me to be driven pretty much entirely by Bill Browder, who they quote in the article, who I can't imagine who else would have given them this information, and who also seems to be tied pretty directly to the coverage of Natalia Veselnitskaya over the last couple of years. Can you please give us a backstory, both of this story, specifically from the Daily Beast, as well as how this story, not in the chemical weapons program, but the Trump Tower meeting, has been covered since it happened over the past 2 years, Lee?
Well, yeah, let's also talk about why this is important, because I think it is. This is they're telling you what the U.S. is going to start saying in the next few months. So this is another sanctions deal, like you guys were talking about before the break. They want to apply sanctions as punishment they don't have to prove the sanctions. This is really important to understand. So they've been saying, for instance, they sanctioned Russia earlier in the month, March 4th, right around there. And they said, we're sanctioning Russia because the FSB poisoned Alexei Navalny. Now, that's what they're saying. They actually, if you read the sanctions memo and the fact sheet that comes with it, they offer no proof of this whatsoever. They can't prove it. So what they say is, our intelligence agencies are saying with a high degree of confidence, and they even have a helpful chart on what a high degree of confidence looks like. And I'm not joking, but they don't have any proof whatsoever. So what's going on now? When I saw this story, which we'll get into it, but this story is like an assortment pack. You know how when stores are going out of business, right? Like big department stores or whatever. On the last couple days, they start literally selling the shelves and the carpet. You know what I'm saying? Like everything must
totally
go. That's what they're doing here. This is every accusation against Russia. Magnitsky, the Trump Tower meeting, everything. Navalny poisoning, Novichok, the Skripal case, everything all thrown together. And there's no proof to it. Again, no proof whatsoever. But let's talk about what's really going on here. So when the U.S. issued those sanctions, and you can find it, but it's not easy, they didn't just sanction people like the head of the Russian prison system and, FSB officials. They did. And as you say, they have no assets and aren't coming here, so it's nothing. But they sanctioned companies as well. And 3 of the companies, guys, are not Russian. Now, this is really significant. Think about this. They're sanctioning Russia over the Navalny poisoning, but they also sanctioned 2 German chemical companies and 1 Swiss one. Now, just ponder that for a second. That's us that sanction our allies, right? I mean, not these companies specifically, but German companies. It puts Germany, our ally, in a tricky position. Do they go along with them? Now, why are we doing that? So I immediately looked up the name of one of the companies. I just did a standard DuckDuckGo search. And the first thing I found was an op-ed from a guy back on March 4th talking about the sanctions that we just put out. And he brought up this German company. And the point of his editorial was, why is Angela Merkel putting up with Russia using a German company to poison Alexei Navalny? Because that's what their claim is. Again, no proof. And the trick here was, when you read the whole op-ed, it was the very last line of the op-ed where the light bulb suddenly goes, ding, what's going on? The last line was something like, and the U.S. needs to sanction Nord Stream 2 pipeline into the ground. Now, that was basically the sentence. The U.S. needs to sanction, why is Germany putting up with this? We need to get, and I was like, aha. So the reason they're sanctioning those companies is the U.S. has been desperate to get rid of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline for a while now, right? For years. And they haven't been able to do it. They've tried to convince Germany, who's an ally. They've tried to strong arm them a little bit. And now what they're doing is they're trying to, I'm calling it sanction shame them. They're trying to say, look, Russia used a German company. Aren't you going to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline now? And you watch. That is, and once I saw that, everything cleared up for me. Because, and by the way, this came out about 2 weeks before that Daily Beast story, which I'll talk about. But the reason, by the way, I'm getting to that last is because literally the story's ridiculous and has no proof. It really is a everything must go sale. But the important thing to understand here is these sanctions and these stories and this Daily Beast story let you know what the coming narrative is. In other words, the U.S. is going to use this narrative to continue to sanction Russia if they can, and continue to sanction Germany and Switzerland. By the way, both countries that Bill Browder's had trouble with in the past. Switzerland dropped a case they were pursuing on behalf of Bill Browder recently. And of course, Germany's home of Der Spiegel, the great investigative magazine, which is one of the only magazines ever in the world to actually tell the truth about Bill Browder. So I wonder, I agree that Bill Browder is the center of this. But when you look at, does this make sense? When you look at this is a way to predict the future actions of the U.S. They're telling you what they're going to do. And if you just...
It 100% makes sense. This totally makes sense. And the thing with the Magnitsky style sanctions, which are a relatively recent phenomenon since the passage in the United States of the Magnitsky Act, and since attempts have been ongoing, sometimes successfully, to pass it in various countries and in the EU, which again changed the name. I think it's the Global Magnitsky Act, or I forget exactly what their specific version of the act is named, but they kind of threw Browder slightly under the bus in the naming of it, which is it's superficial, but whatever. This new phenomenon of these Magnitsky individual style sanctions, they don't work in the long run, because any country or individual that fears that they may face them just starts to move their assets out of the United States. They start to clear their obligations. And so what the U.S. is left with, if it wants to continue to use these things, is you turn them on our allies. And you can see this. I mean, you're bringing up the case of the German companies being sanctioned. You brought up Switzerland. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago with SWIFT, where SWIFT, the sort of international financial funds transfer service, members of their board were apparently threatened with and afraid of being sanctioned. And so they decided to cut off Iran's access to international funding. So it's this sort of interesting, triangulation where if you can't use this weapon against your enemies because it's just not directly effective against them, you need to start to use it against your supposed friends. But in the process, you undercut your own diplomatic ties. You dig the ditch that you're in a bit deeper. I'm worried that it's not a good tool for us to be using. We need to go into a break. We're going to be coming back on this and Sidney Powell in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be back with Lee on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So recently, one of the interesting stories that have come out is a defamation lawsuit against Sidney Powell. Now, if you remember, Sidney Powell was a lawyer that was too crazy for Giuliani, and some of her claims about basically an international communist plot to work with the CIA and Governor Kemp to steal the election for one Joe Biden. Let's play the clip. This clip is phenomenal.
Georgia's probably going to be the first state I'm going to blow up, and Mr. Kemp and the Secretary of State need to go with it because they're in on the Dominion scam with their last-minute purchase or award of a contract to Dominion of $100 million. The State Bureau of Investigation for Georgia ought to be looking into the financial benefits received by Mr. Kemp and the Secretary of State's family about that time.
Just to clarify, you're saying that Governor Kemp, who's been a longtime ally of the president, is directly involved because of financial benefit in the conspiracy to defeat the president in Georgia?
We have certainly been told that there is evidence of that, and it would warrant an investigation if anybody were actually going to do an honest investigation.
What more could you tell us about that alleged conspiracy? Is the governor's involvement?
I can't give you any more details on that now, but it would certainly warrant an investigation.
It would certainly warrant an investigation. At this point, Giuliani basically separated himself from her. They tried to act as if she wasn't part of Trump's team, and that didn't go well. And there was expectations that she was going to be sued, and she was. In January, Dominion Voting Systems opened up a $1.3 billion defamation suit because of stuff just like that. You're basically damaging the reputation of our company. Well, now Powell is calling for that case to be dismissed, arguing in a motion that, quote, no reasonable person, unquote, would conclude that her accusations of Dominion's election rigging scheme, quote, were truly statements of fact, unquote. Think about that. No reasonable person will come to the conclusion that what I was saying during that time made any sense at all. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. To have a conversation about this, we're joined by Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, thank you for joining us and continuing to join us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
So what did you think about, well, two things. Did you believe that the communists were working with the CIA to raise the ghost of Hugo Chavez to help Donald Trump win that election? And on top of that, are you surprised by this? I don't know what this is. I mean, like, that's an astonishing defense. Nobody in their right mind would have believed what I was saying here, so I should be okay. That's astonishing. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, okay, first off, let me answer the first question first. I'm not a Sidney Powell fan. Wasn't during the election. Was specifically calling her out. Thought she was bad for Trump and the Trump team, and so on and so on. However, I'm going to disappoint everybody. This is actually not an astonishing defense. It is a common defense, and this has to do with defamation law and the modern way that that some people defend themselves in defamation law cases. So, Rachel Maddow has used this same defense. Okay, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones have used this same defense, and the defense is no reasonable person would take this as a fact. And let me explain. Again, it's easy to goof on Sidney Powell, but she's not actually saying the way your summary said. She's not saying that. Well, here's what she's saying. When you're dealing with defamation, truth is an absolute defense. So that's one area. And a lot of times, I'm a subject of a defamation suit right now, and it's, in my opinion, meritless. They don't even state a claim where I said anything incorrect. In this case, this is a very big defamation suit, and there's legal issues and there's PR issues going on here. So if you listen to what she said in that clip there, if we're to play it again, she's not making a claim. And I'll repeat that because I want people to understand. She didn't make a claim. In fact, when she was asked, she was very savvy in that little clip there. When she was asked, well, are we going to find this? She said, well, I think it needs to be investigated. She didn't make a claim of fact, because claims of fact are what can get you in trouble in a defamation case. What she says in her defense, and she's correct, is that she was saying she'd seen depositions, she'd seen statements by people, she'd seen paperwork, and that's all true. She'd seen depositions, for instance. Now, I don't think that they were valid depositions, but that's again aside from the point. What she's saying is, in her defense, and like I say, Maddow has used the same defense, is no reasonable person would think that me, Sidney Powell, saying I'm reading a deposition is the same as me, Sidney Powell, making a statement of fact. In other words, she's saying this person said it and I'm repeating it. Now, again, whether that's a good defense in defamation.
That's thin. That's thin. Because my issue with this is she jumped around the country telling people this stuff. This was the stuff that she was pushing. And that clip was much longer than that. That was like a 20-minute interview where she's basically making this argument about how, the election was stolen. And so fair enough, if you're saying that it was just defamation, who told her that Brian Kemp was part of the mix and the CIA was part of the mix? Was that also a deposition that somebody told her that?
Well, that's why you have a trial. She had documents and she had other stuff. And what she's saying is that the thing is, our country, and you can think this is good or bad, but our country makes it difficult to sue for defamation and win. It makes it difficult. The case I mentioned I'm involved in, it's been going on years and involves the Charlottesville case. They literally don't name a statement I said that was incorrect because I didn't say anything incorrect. And that has been going on for like 2 or 3 years now, and it doesn't go to trial in Virginia until next year. Next year.
Can you talk about that case at all? You allude to it, so I know you're thinking about it. And just whether you want to talk about it in the context of this, if you want to talk about it even obliquely, feel free to, just to give a little bit of context.
No, I'm having to deal with it. I have another set of interrogatories. And one of the things they're asking for, and I believe, I'm not looking at the paperwork, so I don't want to misstate this, but if I were looking at the interrogatories, my recollection is they're asking me to mention every time I brought up George Soros between 2015 and 2019. Now ponder that.
That's
I don't have that
horrible.
information.
That's horrible. How would you
Right.
ever know that?
Well, that's right. And let's use a non-controversial example, Jamal. Let's say I legally said to you, you need to submit, and if you don't submit them all, you're in violation of the court order, by the way. Submit every time you brought up Medicare for all between 2015 and 2019. The answer is you have no idea, right? You're not.
Every day of my life. Every day of my life.
Yeah, but you need to specifically name them. Do either of you guys keep track, for instance, of every appearance that you make? Like whenever you're a guest somewhere, do you write it down in the book of places I was a? No, I don't.
No.
Right?
Maybe I should be. I mean, that sounds a little bit self-censored, but I mean, not even just in preparation, but just so I have a cool little backlog to look at. I mean, this sounds like lawfare. It sounds like lawfare against you.
Yes.
The $1.3 billion in defamation defamatory compensation that Dominion is seeking. That seems like a lot of money, though. Is there another way to look at this? Is that just punitive on their part, or do you think they have a good case to make that they actually were defamed to that extent and that they would need that amount of money to make up for it?
Among the problems I have, one of them is not that I'm a lawyer. Whatever I got going on, I'm not a lawyer, so thank God for that. I'm not a lawyer, but like I say, this no reasonable person argument. You'll see that exact language come up over and over again recently. What they're trying to do is say, I was not making this as a statement of fact, and therefore criticizing me is violating my First Amendment rights. Because here's the thing. You do have a right. Does Sidney Powell have a right, for instance, or anybody, to not like Dominion and to think they're crooked and to whatever? You see what I'm saying?
Well, she can have a right to say that, but she can't turn around and say that the voting systems were somehow dodgy or that they were somehow rigged or cheated or working with the CIA. That's different. I mean, because at that point, that gets into how they do their business and whether or not there's a good faith belief that they are actually engaging in those acts. Like, meaning, I had no issue with Donald Trump.
And that's what she's saying. She's saying that she has a good faith belief that came up, and she's First Amendment issues come up in defamation cases all the time. So unfortunately, this attack on Sidney Powell, who again I'm not a fan of, is a fake media attack. Because if you research this, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is actually a common defense now in defamation law, particularly when you're dealing with high-profile political people. And I don't know. I'm not trying to adjudicate the case. A jury or a judge may look at this case and decide that she had crossed the line in certain circumstances. And she may have. And I'm not trying to say she didn't. I'm just trying to tell people that, unfortunately, this is the way defamation law is practiced in 2021 in America. It's common to make statements like that. And whenever they do, you'll find those people's political opponents going, oh, look, they say no reasonable person should believe what Rachel Maddow says. Let's say, if you don't like Rachel Maddow. You see what I'm saying? Because it's the easiest thing in the world, but they're using the phrase no reasonable person for a very specific reason, because that's one of the tests that a court applies when they're looking at it. Would a reasonable person have thought this was a statement of fact? And Powell's answer is one of her answers. And again, I don't know if it's consistent, but I could hear it in that clip. She didn't say, I've investigated this, I know this, and in fact, Dominion did this. She said, well, could be. And that's what people need to watch out for in this, because, the propaganda on all sides is rampant. And when you get into these, relatively complex legal things, you got to just watch out for it. And that's part of what's, again, it's unfortunate. And I don't say any of this I'm not trying to defend Sidney Powell. I'm just saying, if you look into it, you'll see this is the way they defend against defamation law, and it always gets goofed on. So
Well,
I
because
don't.
it
I don't
sounds
think.
it sounds utterly ludicrous. My mom was like, "I never want you to be a lawyer," and it's for stuff like this, like to go for like 2 months, telling anybody that will listen that it's rigged, that it's being cheated, that the CIA is working with the Nicolas Maduro and the communists. I mean, like for 2 months for like doing this, and then to get into court and turn around and say nobody with a brain and eyes and ears should have believed me in that. And it's
Well,
like,
she didn't say should have believed me.
okay,
She
nobody
said no
with a
reasonable
reasonable.
person would think I'm making a statement of fact.
That's fair. That's fair.
And it
That's a
seems like
difference.
the two parts that this hinges upon are no reasonable,
Reasonable,
person, which you
right.
already got into, and statement of fact. And the case here, and please correct me because I'm probably going to be wrong in how I state this, but the case here is effectively she's saying she was reporting what had been told to her in good faith. She wasn't asserting things independently. She's basically acting as a conduit through which information is coming, and she got that information in good faith and was reporting on it in good faith. Is that broadly rightly? You got it close to
No,
it, but-
that's correct. And if the company wanted to sue, for instance, the guy who put out the deposition, who nobody's heard of, right? That would be a much clearer case because he's in a deposition. Now, he might have a defense that, again, I'm not a lawyer, so maybe I'm wrong, that in a deposition, statements you make, you can't be sued for. Does that mean that's possible? But I think the reason they sued Sidney Powell and not this guy is because Sidney Powell, A, has deeper pockets and she's a bigger name.
Well,
and
she's
you're
been
right,
running,
it is lawfare.
and she's been running around the country. I mean, come on. That voting system company, she went after them whole hog, and they acted as if this company was just fraudulent and shady. They could have ended this company's ability to even do the job. Like they could. I guess my point is, she could have destroyed this company between her, Trump, Giuliani, and some of the other people that were making these accusations. I don't think it's insane of her or insane of the company to say, yes, we need to punitively show in court that they are wrong. And there's this other aspect of cash.
I want to point out that Jamal, this is not a standard left-leaning thing. I get, at least historically, to defend a company.
I know, right?
To put a company on higher ground than free speech protections in the United States, which I think is fundamentally what this comes to. And please correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, you think
what
it's free
this comes
speech?
down to for you, Lee?
How's it free speech? It's like can I say bad things about you? Can I say, well, Shane slapped my wife when he was, I don't know, doing something?
No, because that is a specific accusation of a crime. As far as I can tell, that's your specific. And
well,
what
is fraud? What is election theft? Election theft is a massive crime. If what she was saying was right, it was one of the largest crimes in the history of this country.
But I'll put it like this: if you said I heard from someone that Shane slapped my wife, and again, this is sloppy, admittedly. I don't know, Lee. What's your take on that?
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you said Shane's a crook, right? I think that statement falls under, and we've had Tyler Nixon on our show. I think you guys have had Tyler on. Tyler's an attorney. Yeah. And once Tyler used a word I like, puffery, in the course of an interview. Puffery, of course, Tyler's an attorney. Puffery is you're allowed for puffery. In fact, in the dominant Supreme Court decision is New York Times v. Sullivan. And in the course of New York Times v. Sullivan, they say journalists have the right to get stories wrong. And God bless them for saying it. What they said basically in New York Times v. Sullivan is a certain amount of slop is okay. In other words, when you're trying to report a story, the standard can't be you need to get every single thing exactly right. Right?
Yeah,
if you can make errors. And then
she's
someone
not
can come
a
to you
journalist. She's a lawyer who is representing a client for cash and went out and basically put a knife in a voting company for that client. That's what took place. So I get the puffery from the standpoint of journalists, but from the standpoint of a lawyer, and even this notion that somebody told me that, but you have to have a good faith belief that at least, I mean, somebody can tell you anything. If I'm going to go out and I'm going to get the largest megaphones that I can find, and I'm going to recount that over and over again as if it's a statement of fact, And fair enough. If you want to say that that's not a statement of fact, I would say she went from pillar to post basically saying just that, and the claim got more extravagant. Unless she had a good faith belief that the CIA was working with Governor Kemp and the communists to get rid of the election, I don't care who told her that. The fact that she was going and telling all of those various people about that could have ended that company's existence. That's my issue.
I think we really do got to close this out. So I'm going to close this out here. But I don't think that Lee was just saying that. I think that that's his reading of the law based on previous cases. In other words, it's not just an arbitrary assertion. I think it's him looking at what's happened in the past. But I in some sense, Jamal, I also think this was egregious. And so I don't know what the fallout from this is. I understand why Dominion filed the lawsuit, but I can also see it as lawfare. And again, $1.3 billion is a lot of money. I'm pretty sure Sidney Powell, she may have deep pockets, but I severely doubt they're that.
That number's
we got to
punitive.
close out, though.
That number's punitive.
Yes. Lee, thank you for joining us.
Sure, you bet. Thanks for having me on the show. Always great to be on.
Hey, great to have you. For those listening, Lee Stranahan is a Sputnik news analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. You can follow Lee on Twitter at Stranahan. Also check out populist.tv on YouTube. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are in an open call-in segment, admittedly an attenuated one. It's about 7 minutes, 6.5 minutes from now until the end of this hour, and we need to go to a break at that point and come back with headlines. But that still leaves us with some time here. If you want to call in, 202-521-1320, that is the number. Again, 202-521-1320. But if you want to, I'd get to it. So we got about six minutes here. Tomorrow, I know where you stand on this one. I'm trying to sort of arbitrate that stuff, and I get what my dad was saying. I get what Lee was saying. I get what you're saying too, which is she was going out there from pillar to post saying this stuff, and defaming this company effectively. I don't want to make a specific criminal allegation here, but I understand that colloquially she was saying all sorts of stuff that would cause negative economic fallout on this company. I get, but on the other hand, $1.3 billion is a lot of money. She does not have that much money.
Well, that's normal, though.
Sure, if she does, her tax attorneys deserve a lot of money too, because I don't know how she would have managed to squirrel that away. I haven't checked into her net worth in a little while here. I suppose I could do so, but what's your take? Those
companies sue for anything, man. That thing could have been $10 billion as far as that company was concerned. Like, the numbers are usually ridiculously large. So that part didn't necessarily shock me. They usually make them high. They're probably saying the value of the company or the value of the damage or something like that. Yeah, to me,
net worth of $1 million. I'm seeing that estimated. So 1,300 times more money than she has in all assets total.
Yeah, they're trying
most
to
of which
bankrupt
is
her.
probably in the form of real estate or something like that. Just a guess. Not easy to liquidate.
No, this is punitive.
It's punitive, and I hear you.
Well, no, go ahead, please continue. I was just saying, yeah, it's punitive.
It is. It is. It is. Again, 202-521-1320. And lawfare is a real deal. It's brutal stuff. And good for lawyers. And I'm free to disparage them because you aren't one, thanks to your mom. But good for lawyers But the fact that I remember Brett Kimberlin, who I don't even know that I've talked about since we came into this show. I might have talked about him once or twice, but I remember dealing with this guy, never firsthand, but always through my dad. He's a Indiana Speedway bomber, literally a convicted bomber who then went on to become a Democratic operative, was working with Alexandra Chalupa back in 2016. I believe it was early 2016. It may have been late 2015 as well. I forget the exact timeline. Anyway, he did this stuff all the time. He would file lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. I believe my dad was actually, and I might be misremembering, so please, I won't give it too much. I think he was briefly involved in one of these, and then it went nowhere. But the point is, I've seen how this works, and it's brutal. And people, as long as you have enough money, and particularly if you're willing to represent yourself, you can just do so much against people. And what can they do in response? Unless they've got the training for it, they have to shell out a bunch of money on lawyers. They have to bring in outside help. That, of course, runs up bills, and it just drags on for years and years and years and years. And it's a drag on our legal system too, because again, even though it might be good for the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, et cetera, what you have is a legal system that is filled with more and more puffery over time. Not to abuse that word again, just more and more of nothing as people try to wage legal battles. I guess it's better than duels, though. I guess that's one way to look at it. Better fighting with a pen than fighting with a sword, although some may disagree with that. But
speaking of the legal fare stuff or the warfare stuff, do you remember when Hillary Clinton was running and they were talking about gun violence? And Hillary Clinton was like, she said she wanted to basically pass a law that made the gun manufacturers legally responsible. I mean, basically, you could sue a gun manufacturer for the violence used by the gun. I think it was something like that, or the shop that sold the gun. And it was like, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. You're basically saying guns are legal products, guns kill, and yet you're going to sue the place for selling a legal product. How does that work? But this was kind of an end around to try to basically cripple the gun industry. So Joe Biden is now talking about gun safety bills. These are the things that's on the agenda after the recent shooting. Guess who opposes the two bills? I don't even know what the two bills are, so I can't even give my take on what I think they're good or bad. But guess who opposes the two bills that the House of Representatives passed earlier this month on gun safety? Give me one guess.
I'm not gonna.
Joe Manchin.
I refuse to. Just tell me.
Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin. Once again, he's like, yeah, I disagree with that. And it's like, why are you letting this guy basically run your presidency? Joe Biden is talking about executive action. But again, executive action on some level, depending upon what the action is somewhat of a failure of an ability to kind of marshal your forces in the way that you're supposed to be able to marshal your forces to get stuff done. I mean, if you got rid of the filibuster, you wouldn't need to do that. If you were able to command the bully pulpit, you wouldn't need to do that. I make the point, this is a failure of politics, not an extension, an ascendancy of it. Manchin is embarrassing, and that he needs to be mitigated, full stop. Because the Senate has no more power than the House to put something in a bill or take something out of a bill. And if you're just going to be stuck with, well, Manchin didn't like it, so what? If you need to have certain level of intransigence, if you need to have a political fight over it, have the political fight over it. But allowing Manchin to always just say, yep, I'm against that, bing, and that's the end of it, is humiliating. And by the way, that's not an excuse for failure. What do you think, Shane? I'm aggravated by it because I see the thing. I don't even know what the bill is. It's just Manchin again.
You don't like him, but it gives him a lot of power. I mean, he's the most right-leaning Democrat in the Senate, and West Virginian, certainly not usually a deep blue state, and of course that gives him a lot of power. He's the it was going to be Kamala Harris that was the deciding vote, but realistically it's actually him. So that makes him a sort of kingmaker in politics. People come to him to broker deals, gives him a lot of leverage. It is to his benefit. And that's just a consequence of the narrow majority that the Democrats won. Technically a 50-50 split, but of course with Harris, it would be a majority. Although no longer with Manchin. Point about Democratic politics, we need to close this show out. Close this hour out. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of today's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more across every side of every political aisle. We're that all over the place, although we usually come back to the center, at least our center, where your political compass is spun wild. It's been wild in search of some, new way of looking at things, covering news, events, politics across our divided states and our divided globe. We are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Man, I'm all over the place. This is why you shouldn't do this stuff impromptu.
I've stopped doing that. I've stopped trying.
James Stranahan. Go for it, man.
Yeah, I've stopped trying. And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And again, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Sometimes I have enough of my wits about me that I can pull that kind of thing off, but usually that's why you have a template, so that you can follow it. And I defiantly did not, and I definitely reaped what I sowed. Anyway, hope everybody's morning continues to go well this morning. If you're joining us just now, hope it's beautiful for you out there. And if you've been with us the full 2 hours so far, I hope we have enriched your morning. Just to give you a brief overview of today's show, at 7:30 we spoke with Alexander Mercouris about the trial of Craig Murray and the affair between Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, also some turkey. I'm just going to point this out. The fish, sturgeon, actually do eat salmon, like the fish, salmon. I had this conversation on the back end with Jamarl. And this really leads me to wonder, why are more people, maybe it's just a serious affair, why are more people not making jokes involving sturgeon and salmon when they're talking about the situation in Scotland? But for that matter, why did we not make a joke in our second segment about how we're having a dish talking sturgeon, salmon, and even some turkey all in the same segment? I really should have pulled that out, but I don't know. Alexander, he's just so professional that I don't,
I can make a joke and he'll just kind of look at you with that kind of British, it's like okay.
Well, it's disdain because it's not as good as British.
Well,
British
we tried that show, that story on the Chinese people in the airports basically saying we need the anal COVID test. And we were like, that is a funny story. And we thought this is going to get him to laugh. He's going to totally take the story. He took that story like a straight man taking the story. He took it so seriously. It's like, oh, dude, the story's supposed to be funny. Yeah.
He does. No. British people. I'm not going to say anything about British people, quote unquote. But there are these trends. The whole stiff upper lip thing. They do have a deep sense of humor, though, and I think it might come in a sort of Freudian sense from repressing laughter. But maybe that's just the American in me lashing out. Anyway, at 7:30 we spoke with Alexander Mercouris. I just mentioned that conversation. At 8:15 we just finished up a couple of minutes ago a conversation with Lee Stranahan, during which we talked about the Magnitsky Act, Magnitsky-style sanctions, and a new story coming out from the Daily Beast, and it about a German chemical company trying to link it to Russia's alleged poisoning of Navalny with a nerve agent. It's an interesting thing, and he went into the backstory. We also talked about Sidney Powell, the defamation case being brought against her et al., among others, by Dominion, the polling company that was the subject of much controversy during the post-election sort of interregnum period, where there was still much disagreement about who exactly would be president, because a lot of Trump supporters were alleging that there was serious election fraud. Of course, that led to January 6th. I would argue that put the tombstone on the grave of hopes that Trump would be president in 2021. Anyway, just finished up that conversation with Lee. In this hour, we're going to be talking with John Kiriakou from 9:15 to 9:45, also the co-host, by the way, of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, along with Lee. We'll be talking with John about Biden's China policies and John's whistleblowing during the Iraq War. Maybe more than that, too. But those are both enough for pack segments right there. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, at least 892 new coronavirus deaths and 58,764 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 54,810 cases per day. That's a decrease of 7% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,957,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more than 543,000 have died from it. Russian President Vladimir Putin, has been vaccinated against COVID-19. Kremlin did not specify which vaccine Putin received, but we can safely assume it was probably one of the 3 Russian-developed vaccines. The aim was to underline that, quote, all 3 Russian vaccines are absolutely reliable, very good, and effective, end quote. Vaccination was not lively publicized, was not publicized live, and when asked if people would believe Putin actually received the shot, spokesman Dmitry Peskov said people would just have to, quote, take our word for it, end quote. Employers such as Target, Trader Joe's, McDonald's, and Dollar General are among a growing list of companies giving workers time off and extra money to get vaccinated for COVID-19. Cash and labor incentives there. Krispy Kreme Donuts, meanwhile, is offering anyone with proof of a COVID vaccination a free donut. And a marijuana dispensary in Walled Lake, Michigan, is giving anyone over the age of 21 with proof of vaccination a free pre-rolled joint. According to a report by the Society for Human Resource Management, nearly 1/4 of employed Americans who won't get vaccinated would consider getting their shot if offered a cash bonus or stipend, or a donut and a joint. But we'll see about that. Countries across the globe took to the streets last weekend to demand an end to their government's coronavirus regulations, marking the first anniversary of coronavirus lockdowns in several nations. Participants in the worldwide Rally for Freedom marched in a bunch of countries, perhaps most notably Canada, the USA, Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Italy, many more. Not going to get into all of them. They were protesting lockdowns, mask mandates, and the promotion of the COVID-19 vaccines. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said Tuesday that coronavirus infections are rising too fast to allow relaxation of the country's tough lockdown, and instead extended it for a further 3 weeks. This comes after Germany also extended its lockdown for 3 more weeks. A lot of countries are. I'll put it like that. Meanwhile, things in the United States are lightening up. We'll see how long that lasts, but numbers are continuing to go down. The cases have been sort of leveling out, but also still dropping. And deaths just earlier, I believe it was on Monday, hit their lowest number in like 5 months. It was around 500 deaths, if I'm recalling correctly. And it's been a while since we've seen deaths that low. On the other side of the cold and flu season is one way to look at it. Back to the headlines. In national political news, U.S. President Joe Biden will join a video summit of European Union leaders on Thursday to discuss improving transatlantic cooperation. The 27 EU leaders have a regular 2-day summit starting Thursday, where they will discuss everything from vaccine strategy to relations with Russia. A phone call between Biden and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen clinched a trade breakthrough with a 4-month suspension of tariffs used in the long-standing Airbus-Boeing dispute. The dispute stems from the European Union and the United States claiming that each other's airplane manufacturer is unfairly subsidized. Puerto Rico has been granted immediate access to $912 million in federal funds that had not been available to students in public and private schools on the island as a result of restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. That was announced by Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona on Monday. The new funds come less than 2 weeks after Puerto Rico reopened dozens of public and private schools for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic began. New York, meanwhile, saw several different protests over the weekend as residents took part in a Tax the Rich march. Also attended dueling rallies against and in support of Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has come under fire for killing thousands of grandmothers and grandfathers with his response to COVID-19, taking people who are in nursing homes, putting them in hospitals, and then putting them back in nursing homes before they can been proved, before they would have fully recovered from COVID, ostensibly spreading it when they got put back in the nursing homes, and possibly worse than that, although I actually wouldn't say so myself, but some would say so, tried to hide it with an aide of his in a private meeting in Democratic lawmakers, saying that they froze under the scrutiny of Trump's Justice Department and effectively tried to keep those numbers artificially lowered. Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, came out with a report that alleged that, and they have since updated the numbers, and yeah, they were lowered by quite a bit. Also, against Andrew Cuomo recently, string of sexual harassment allegations, which have been growing and mounting. Motions in the New York Assembly right now for Cuomo to be impeached. He said he's not going to resign. It's a big mess for Cuomo. In international news, Russia's foreign envoy Sergei Lavrov said that relations between the EU and Russia had been destroyed unilaterally by decisions made in Brussels, saying that Russia no longer had relations with the EU after Brussels destroyed them. would be willing to come back to the table with the EU if and when the bloc is ready to remove this anomaly in relations, quote unquote. This came during a conversation in Beijing with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, during which both of them called the latest batch of sanctions against the two countries interference. Meanwhile, China on Tuesday threatened retaliation against the U.S. over sanctions that targeted Beijing's alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang province, with top Chinese officials vowing that America and its allies will, quote, pay a price for their ignorance and arrogance, end quote. The sanctions announced Monday by the U.S., Canada, the United Kingdom, and the European Union mark the latest international step to condemn and punish China for its alleged abusive treatment of Uyghur Muslims and other minority groups in Xinjiang. Chinese Communist Party officials denied the allegations made by the Biden administration and issued a fiery defense that attacked the U.S. for its history of slavery, the deaths of civilians in Afghanistan and Syria, and the treatment of indigenous people across North America. The country of North Korea has test-fired 2 short-range cruise missiles over the weekend. South Korean defense officials confirmed on Wednesday that the test took place off the west coast of North Korea on Sunday, just days after the country accused the United States and South Korea of raising a stink on the Korean Peninsula with their annual military drills. It did not violate United Nations resolutions, which ban North Korea from developing or testing ballistic missile technologies. However, it did mark the first test since Biden has taken office.
Just real quick, it's a tit for tat. We're pretending as if we're about to invade their country. They always say, we hate the fact that you're doing that. And their response is to fire off a missile. It's like, well, we hate the fact that you're firing off a missile. Well, we hate the fact that you're pretending that you're going to invade our country. There's that. Now, the American audience doesn't know that we were holding those military drills. Only thing they see are the missile fires. It's almost like if you saw a guy in the park just swinging left and right, and he's like, God, that guy's tweaked out. And miss the fact that there's an invisible man there punching back. It's that. And I've had conversations with people that have no idea about these military drills that take place. They had no idea about the Korean War. They had no idea that a fifth of the population was killed in that war. Everything that, every brick was bombed twice. Something like that. I'm being hyperbolic, but to get across the level of devastation, we forgot that war. In fact, it's even called a forgotten war here. They didn't. And so whatever, people want to think of Kim Jong-un and crazy and everything else, he still has this sense of self-preservation. And yeah, those missiles are a response. Just wanted to point it out.
Yes. Yeah. On to the next headline here. And I want to come back to this because I think we'll talk about it. A U.S. senator urged the Biden administration Tuesday to lift a ban on diesel fuel swaps with Venezuela, arguing that sanctions are worsening the South American country's dire humanitarian crisis. That senator is Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He's a Democratic member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for the U.S. to end what he called the misguided policy. He said that immediately restoring diesel swaps would provide life-saving relief for millions of Venezuelans, and said that the ban has created no real political leverage with Maduro, who was able to maneuver around the unilateral sanctions. In our conversation about this earlier, I think I kind of responded to something you said. He's making the humanitarian case here. He's also making the utilitarian one, at least from our perspective, which is they're not useful. The sanctions that we're imposing in this case aren't actually getting what we want. He's able to work around them. But he is also making the humanitarian case, which is, if we cut the sanctions off, this could help millions of Venezuelans. That's good for them. And in the long run, I'm guessing he thinks it would be good for us, too. We'd have a better relationship with this significant powerhouse of a country in its own way. Although its economy's been hit, they've got a lot of oil. And so, finding some way to deal with them would probably be in the best of interest for the United States. Some way, that is, other than mass sanctions.
Yeah, well, we don't
Carl,
want
take on that?
Cooperation. We want sublimation, if that makes sense. We don't want to have this kind of agreement where we can have a win-win relationship and, I'll get this, you get that. No, we don't want that. We want you to lose. You're not in a position to even negotiate with us. You're not of worth, you're not of caliber, etc. Why do you think the Chinese person, Wang, I can't think of his name, basically told him, you are not of standing to have this fight from a position of authority with me? Because that's the tact that's always taken. And honestly, it's brutally racist. Why don't the United States believe that that country should be able to run its own affairs, or that South American countries shouldn't be able to run their own affairs? They should be able to. It's insane. And part of it is, yes, self-interest and everything else. But you could cooperate with Maduro, but you can't cooperate with him if you're trying to kill him or have a violent uprising. Like, those things don't work together. I don't even understand it. The United States will come out and say Putin is a violent killer, and in the same breath say, but we want to work with him. They would say the same thing about China. China is committing genocide, but we want to work with them. They're a partner. Why do you believe that you could say these things, that you can create these framings of the world about these various countries, and then turn around in the same breath and say, however, we want to come to terms? It's bizarre.
They're self-contradictory. There's a lot of internal dissonance in the statements. And I want to hear what our next guest has to say about it, which is why I'm going to close this out of our headlines. Those were headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're coming back on the other side of the short break with our next guest, John Kiriakou, former CIA officer, author, and co-host of a show on this network. Again, we'll be back with John on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Donald Trump brought a certain level of bellicosity to the White House that I don't think we've seen in our lifetime. And people believe that Joe Biden was going to bring down that level of hysteria. And in one situation after the next, that has not seemed to be the case. Even though Joe Biden has been somewhat of an inert president, as it's been called, the bellicosity hasn't necessarily gone anywhere. It's one of those things that seems to be, at this point, a new normal. Mike Pompeo tainting, or at the very least trying to position the White House going forward, made the claim that China was basically committing genocide. Now, where he was getting this from, Mike Pompeo said he lied, cheated, and stole for a living. So you have to take everything what Mike Pompeo said with a huge mountain of salt. But that didn't stop the Biden administration from coming in and reaffirming that very specific point. Foreignpolicy.com makes the point that State Department lawyers concluded insufficient evidence to prove genocide in China. And many of these claims apparently are coming from like one person. They're leaning heavily on it, even from the standpoint of what Reuters is reporting here. A gentleman named, and Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, Jens, I may be pronouncing the name wrong. Zenz, yes, Adrian Zenz. Basically, this is coming from basically one source. China, and this is Reuters, China has been widely condemned for setting up complexes in Xinjiang that it's described as, quote, vocational training centers, unquote, to stamp out extremism and give people new skills, and which others have called concentration camps. The United Nations said at least 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims have been detained in Xinjiang Faith leaders, activist groups, and others have said crimes against humanity, including genocide, are taking place there. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually prove it. And proving it hasn't necessarily been something that has been taking place all that much, just the repeating of it, of the claims. To have a conversation about it, we're joined with former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jamal. Happy to do it.
Absolutely. So the issue with China has been fascinating to me, and on some level, unfortunate. I mean, basically, the Biden administration comes in and says these guys are committing genocide. Now, no reporter, none, not one, would mention, well, there are 1 million Uyghurs that you guys are talking about. We killed 500,000 kids just from Bill Clinton and those sanctions alone. When you get to the Iraq war, we're talking about another 1 million. We're talking about, tens of thousands in Libya, tens of thousands or 500,000 in Syria. Meaning, if the U.S. cares so much about Muslims, why do we seem to be killing millions of them? And in this very specific context, when pointing to the Uyghurs, nobody brings that up. Very strange, since that's one of the most glaring issues ever if you're going to stand and point to China saying they're doing XYZ to Muslims. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah. And by the way, what do you consider this a legitimate attack? Meaning, is there a there to this that I am just missing? Because to me, it seems like they're using the Uyghurs in a similar way that the Mujahideen was being used in Afghanistan to undermine the Soviet Union. But please, take it. What's the framing of this?
Thanks. Wow, there are so many things to say about this. Let's start with the plight of the Uyghurs. We really don't know what the plight of the Uyghurs happens to be. You mentioned Adrian Zance. Everything that we know, everything that we think we know, comes from Adrian Zance, who has a long history as being a right-wing provocateur here in the United States. And we don't know on what he bases his so-called reporting. And so we use words like concentration camps in the mainstream media. We formulate policy around this, a policy of sanctioning China, and we just simply don't have any idea if it's true. My guess is that it's not true. Now, it's hard to get into that part of China for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, it's incredibly remote. Secondly, the Chinese don't like people poking around their country, which is fine. But you can't leap to these conclusions at which you make policy decisions without knowing what the facts are. And we really don't know what the facts are. You raised this second point of sanctions. I'm old enough now to remember when it was a very big deal when the United States decided to impose sanctions on a country. Now they're just wantonly imposed on countries, on people, on companies, and they've become meaningless. Even my parents used to joke whenever they would see in the news that the United States was imposing sanctions on a country. They'd say, ask Castro about sanctions. He'll tell you all you need to know about them. Well, it's not just Castro, it's Saddam Hussein too. You know, we had sanctions for so many years on Iraq with the purpose being to essentially remove Saddam Hussein, to overthrow him. And all it did was embolden him and make him more powerful and make him, you know, the subject of support around the world because of the way these sanctions were torturing the Iraqi people. So they just simply don't work. If anything, they backfire. They backfire and they make their targets even stronger.
Well, they drive them to seek independence from the United States, which it creates, in a weird way, it creates a not an ideological power block, although there's potentially something like that in the making. But it creates long-term economic divisions, which strike against the very core of what the United States seems to have wanted to found our country on and our leadership of the globe internationally over at least a past century. Free trade as the sort of economic tether that ties countries together and keeps them from breaking out into outright war. It seems like we're pushing in the exact opposite direction of that through the use of these sanctions. And they seem, I want to come back to something I was bringing up earlier on in the show, and I want to get your take on it because I'm sure it will be much more informed than mine. But it seems like these sanctions and our reliance on them are increasingly a paltry surrogate for genuine diplomatic effort, genuine statecraft at the highest level, where we're engaged in long-term negotiations and diplomacy with other countries. It seems like we've actually isolated ourselves quite a bit and have come to rely on sanctions, which are relatively easy to implement. They're effectively a diplomatic action you can execute by fiat against another country. What's your take on that? I mean, you've sat in rooms briefing people and being briefed with members of the State Department. What do you think has happened to American diplomacy over time, and what do you think about the claim that I'm making there?
Wow, I think you're exactly right. We had Mark Sloboda on our show, The Backstory, a couple of days ago, and he made an important point, I think, that bears repeating. He said that this latest round of sanctions against Russia wasn't really against Russia. It was against a handful of Russian officials. And they were the sanctions were imposed against Russian officials who don't travel to the United States, are not permitted because of their jobs and their security clearances to own property in the United States or to do business in the United States. And so they're not worth the paper that they're written on. They're more for the consumption of the American people to make it look like we're being tough with Russia on XYZ issue. And you're right, they can be enacted by fiat. I've been in the room where they've been negotiated. I was one of about a half a dozen co-authors of UN Security Council Resolution 1096, which was the add-on to sanctions from UN Security Council Resolution 986 against Iraq after the first Gulf War. And all they do in the end is harm innocent people. So you're right. The goal really of the State Department ought to be to carry on a long-term foreign policy. And we've gotten to the point where we just don't have long-term foreign policies in many parts of the world. We rely simply on the temporary and near-term high that we get from imposing meaningless sanctions.
Well, the sanctions, and tell me if I'm wrong, hurting the population is the point on some level. I mean, the idea being if we can put enough pain on the population.
On some level, it depends on the country, but you're right. On some level, the point is that you make life so uncomfortable for the average person in a given country that the hope is that person will rise up in the streets and overthrow his government. That never, ever works. But that's the reason behind the sanction. You're exactly right.
And that's unfortunate.
Another side of this,
yeah,
it is unfortunate. It doesn't just depend on the country. It also depends on the kind of sanction. The Magnitsky style sanctions, which are individualized sanctions levied against individuals or organizations, those are directed, but they're, I would argue, relatively ineffective. On the other hand, sanctions against countries where you impose trade blockades, you stop providing economic relief, you prevent other countries from providing economic relief or engaging in trade with these countries, that kind of thing. Those are really damaging. And this is something actually a guest we had on a while back on the show, frequent guest, on fault lines throughout its history, Vanessa Beeley. She brought up the idea, why aren't these war crimes? Why are sanctions like these levied against entire populations, collective punishment that kill many people and damage the lives, harm the lives of many, many more than they kill? Why are these not war crimes, John?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I remember in the early 1990s, we went out of our way to exempt things like medicines, for example. And then if the Iraqi people weren't getting medicines, we could blame Saddam Hussein. We went out of our way to exempt food. And if the Iraqi people weren't getting food, we could blame Saddam Hussein. But for one reason or another, the medicines and the food didn't make their way to Iraq. They were jammed up in Jordan. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people died, including tens of thousands of children. So you're right. Why isn't that a war crime? It ought to be a war crime because it is collective punishment. And collective punishment is one of the definitions of a war crime.
We need
But
to
you know,
close this out.
history is written by the victors, and we consider ourselves to be the victors, and so we're never going to have an official debate like that.
And even though I love America and I'm an American first and foremost, I hope in some respect we do not come out on the winning side of this specific issue, because I want history to be right about this. I want this to become de jure, a war crime. I want this to be legally listed as such, because it shouldn't be a tool that any country uses in whatever international rules-based order we're entering into or re-entering on the other side of this crisis. We've got to go to a break. We are joined for this segment and the next by John Kiriakou, talking about China and our relationship with China, and moreover about sanctions in this last segment. John, when we come back, I want to get into the Iraq War and your whistleblowing on that, and get into some of the specifics for folks who may not have heard about that, may not know about that, if that's all right. Also, just past the anniversary of the start of the Iraq War last week, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by John Kiriakou, former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. Follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com, and hear him every Monday through Friday here on Radio Sputnik on The Backstory from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. We'll be right back with John on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're joined by John Kiriakou, former CIA officer, author of books including the CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy, and co-host also of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik. You can check that show out. Here, John and Lee, both of whom we've had on the show this morning, by the way. Lee last hour, John this one. Listen to that every Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. John, 18th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. I believe this last Friday, but nevertheless this last week. We've been talking about that throughout this week. I want to go to you. You blew the whistle on torture techniques used by the American government. Can you please, for folks who don't know the whole backstory here and a lot of the specifics, and we're limited on time, but can you please pick us up wherever makes the most sense for you and talk about the disclosures that you made and the consequences that you faced for making those disclosures? John.
Sure. I blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program in December of 2007, which I'm almost embarrassed to admit was 5.5 years after I learned of the torture program. I just assumed that somebody else would come out and say something because it seemed to me to be so patently illegal. But nobody said anything. And so finally I did. As a result, the FBI investigated me for a little bit more than 4 years, and then finally charged me with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage, coming out of an interview that I gave to ABC News and a second interview that I gave to the New York Times. I ended up doing 23 months in a federal prison for these disclosures and revelations, and I embrace it to this day. May I say something about Iraq, about the Iraq War, if we have time?
Please go for it.
When I was in the CIA, I had returned from Pakistan, where I was chief of counterterrorism operations, returned to headquarters, and I was promoted and named the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. So on my first day on the job, I went to the office and I said to the deputy director, so what's up? What do we do? And he said, well, you've got to sign some security agreements, secrecy agreements. So I went up to the 6th floor of CIA's headquarters, and I signed 6 secrecy agreements. And finally, after I finished signing, I said to the guy, the security officer, all right, so what's up? What are we working on? And very flatly, he said to me, and this was in the early summer of late spring, actually, of 2002. He said, next February, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and we're going to open up the world's largest Air Force base so we can move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia and into Iraq to deprive Saddam Hussein of his ability to say that we were polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques. This was such a ridiculous thing to me. I was so flabbergasted that all I could think to say was, but we haven't caught bin Laden yet. And the response was, the decision's already been made and people have already lined up. He said, on the pro-invasion side, it's the Office of the Vice President, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. And on the anti-invasion side, it's the CIA, the State Department, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, we have no choice. We have to support the invasion. And that's how I learned of the Iraq War. This was completely a political decision. It had nothing to do with any threat against the United States. It was based on the fact that the sanctions just simply hadn't worked over the previous decade plus. And so we were going to go in militarily and finish the job.
But what's the rationale for that? Like, that's the, and look, I know when I'm asking this question, there is no rationale. You know, the foreign policy, or for that matter, domestic policy is might makes right. If you could take it, you can hold it. That's it. But there typically is some idea behind it. Is it really just craven geopolitical interests that we don't like Saddam, we don't want Saddam in that office, so we're going to take that country? I mean, is it that bare bones craven behind the scenes?
I think it was more simple than that. You know, in the hallways at the CIA, Jamaro, we talked about this for months. Why would we do this? We were fighting this war against Al-Qaeda. We had not yet caught those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Why in the world would we divert all of our resources, literally all of our resources, to Saddam Hussein when Saddam Hussein was no threat to us? And the conclusion that most CIA officers came to at the time was that this was an act of revenge by President George W. Bush against Saddam for the attempted assassination of President George H.W. Bush in Kuwait in 1993. Yes.
That makes perfect sense. I've heard that before, but it's really interesting to hear from you that was the opinion being spread behind the scenes by people in the CIA, which is the exact organization that you would expect to be, in some sense, the most in the know about the real motivations for our foreign policy. That's crazy, John.
It's sick, and we weren't in the know, which was even crazier to me. You know, this was a highly compartmentalized operation, and that's why I had to sign so many secrecy agreements when I was finally read into the compartment. But I said, you can't keep this secret forever. And he said, no, certainly we're not. Certainly we're going to have to go public eventually. But right now we're doing the planning, and our role is just to do whatever the Office of the Vice President tells us to do. And, you know, when Vice President Cheney said, we're going to invade Iraq, then by God, we're going to invade Iraq, and we don't ask questions why. That's really what it came down to.
What were the CIA's task in that invasion? Like, if the military's task was to basically put a hole and blow things up, how did the CIA support the operations?
That's a great question. And the funny thing is, the CIA didn't really have many roles in Iraq at first. Mostly it was propaganda. So what you want to do is you go into areas of Iraq that aren't affected by hostilities, which really just means Kurdistan, and you set up clandestine radio stations there. Or you arrange sabotage squads to take out Iraqi communications. Or you try to recruit people close to Saddam Hussein, or maybe Iraqi ambassadors overseas. Or you cold pitch senior Iraqi government officials who are traveling overseas before you invade the country. Really, it was just a support function, just to try to weaken the country. I remember we did one funny thing, and well, funny to me, is we remotely planted a computer virus in the Iraqi military computer system. And what it did is when they would boot up their systems, it would just say, give up, the end is near, you're going to die, this kind of thing.
Really, just like demotivational tactic, effectively.
Yeah, basically that. We used to fly planes. We used to fly these enormous cargo planes really high over Baghdad and just dump billions of dollars worth of Iraqi dinars out of the side of the plane just to flood the economy with fake cash and crash it with, inflation. Stuff like that. Silly stuff. Wastes of the taxpayers' money.
It sounded like, efforts of destabilization. Like you said, Shane, and demoralization. I mean, that's, wow.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And then, the idea was that once U.S. troops finally crossed the border, people would be so demoralized that they would welcome us. There was one senior National Security Council official that I used to deal with all the time, and I really didn't like this guy because he was so supremely arrogant and thought he was the smartest guy in the room, and he really didn't know anything about the Middle East. And so just a few days before our troops crossed the border, he gleefully said, I can't wait until whatever day it was that we were going to cross. He said, they're going to throw flowers on us. And I thought to myself, and I actually said this to my boss, has this guy never met an Arab? Has this guy never been to the Middle East? They're going to throw flowers at us? Would you throw flowers at somebody who invaded the United States if you didn't like your president? I mean, this guy's clearly delusional. And as you know, they didn't throw flowers at us.
That sounds like a view from a kind of ivory tower. And I'm not alleging anything specifically about the institutions that this guy was brought up in or the CIA in general. But that sounds like a view from a vantage where you're so detached from the reality of the situation on the ground, which leads me to think a couple of things. For one thing, it leads me to think that you would be ineffective. I'm not saying this about you specifically, of course, John, but it leads me to think that you would be ineffective if you assume those kinds of things at functionally doing your job, even if you assume that you had the moral weight behind you, at actually demotivating them and bringing them over to your side. Well, by definition, if you don't know what they want or how they're going to respond, if you're so detached from them that you're not going to be in an effective role as an agent doing that work. But in my opinion, even more importantly, it also seems like it would detach you very deeply from the moral consequences of the things that you're doing. It seems like you wouldn't be aware of not just the fact that you're not effective in your role, but how ineffective your role is in pursuing, good or just policies abroad for their country or even, frankly, for ours, for America. John, what's your take on that?
Yes, you're exactly right. These people in positions of authority in policymaking were not students of history. And I'll tell you one thing that was never discussed. And that was the fact that Saddam Hussein, like him or hate him, was a bulwark against Iran. And if your long-term policy goal as an American official is to keep the Sunnis on one side and the Shia Muslims on the other side and keep them constantly in a state of conflict, well, removing that bulwark against Shiism is going to upset the balance. And nobody ever discussed that. The Gulf Arabs, too, even the Kuwaitis, who had been brutalized by Iraqi occupation, even the Kuwaitis said, whoa, wait a minute. We actually like to see a weakened Saddam Hussein. We don't want you to take him out because the Iranians are going to take over the whole region. And that's exactly what happened. So if your goal is to remain relevant in the region and to make sure that American foreign policy over the long term is the policy that's actually, the day-to-day managing factor, well, you lose. And this was an unforced fumble because it's not like we were confronting the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else in the Gulf. We picked that fight and we lost it.
John, let me ask you this. We have one last question. We're coming to the end of the close of the segment. But a day in the life of a CIA operative? What is it like? Meaning, when you guys go in and there's, let's say something needs to get done, the president needs something done, or for that matter, does the CIA operate independently almost of the president in the way that they used to prior? But I guess I'm getting to the planning stages of a particular operation. You know that the public is not going to be made aware of it. You know this stuff is probably going to stay in the black. It's probably going to be a special access. How does that, what's the mechanics of that? Like, take me in the room to that. Like, what does that look like when the people are coming together to set up an operation to do X or Y? And can you give an example of one of those type of operations, for that matter, that might have taken place either in Iraq or that you're aware of?
Sure. Every CIA officer operates under something called an OD, an operating directive. And the operating directive is something that is agreed upon by the entire CIA leadership and approved by both the National Security Council and the Congressional Oversight Committees. So you start with something that's tier 0, which means everybody has to work this issue all the time. So tier 0 would be counterterrorism and nuclear proliferation, for example, or weapons of mass destruction. Tier 1 is something that is critical and everybody needs to be working at it, but our lives aren't at stake. And tier 1 could be, and I'm just making this up because my information now is 18 years old. Tier 1 could be Russia, China, North Korea, counter narcotics, let's say. I don't know. I'm just making that up. And then it goes tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And tier 4 is like, if you have time and you're not doing anything else, then work a tier 4 issue. So within those tiers, depending on which division to which you're assigned, that's sort of where your taskings come from. If you're assigned to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center or to the CIA's Office of Near Eastern Operations or South Asian Operations, these are the issues you're going to be working on all the time. Counterterrorism, counterproliferation, the Afghan heroin trade, Iran, stuff like that. But if you're working on, Latin America, or you're working on propaganda, it's going to be different. And it's not going to be as exciting. There's some guys, Jamaro, who thrive on the adrenaline. And those guys are usually married multiple times. They don't really have ties to the United States. They don't own homes here because they spend their whole lives overseas. And then there are guys who just see this as 25 years, and then you take the early out retirement and go to some defense contractor and live happily ever after. But since 9/11, the big change at the CIA is that it's really become more of a paramilitary organization. So if you're former military, especially if you're former special forces, you have a CIA home. And the CIA is going to send you around the world to kill people or kidnap them.
Wow. The voice that you guys were listening to is John Kiriakou, former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of the books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment, and thank you for joining us, John.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back with the last segment of today's show. We're in the wrap. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We took calls for like 8 minutes at 8:45, and frankly, that was not enough time to do so. But we got a full, 10 now. Man, we just keep pushing over. I mean, great interviews is the thing. We were talking with Lee about Sidney Powell, and it was interesting. And then John talking about the CIA, what it's like to be on the inside, how it's changed over the years. Also, just deeply, deeply, deeply interesting.
Oh, man, I could have kept going
out
with
of my
that.
depth on that issue.
Yeah,
I think I probably know slightly more than your average cookie when it comes to the CIA, but he leaves me feeling out of depth, and that's just because he gives us a sea of knowledge to swim in, and so of course we're going to be out of depth.
Yeah.
You know, his perspective, his history there, deeply, deeply, deeply interesting. But again, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Great show so far, I think.
Yeah, man. It's a really good show. I really, there's so many more questions for John. Like, I am so curious about this stuff. Despite being a lefty, I am a fanatic for war stuff. And like the techniques, the ideas behind it, and even the spycraft stuff, and you know, trying to accomplish an objective and doing so. I wanted to know, what was it like to be in the room when they're forming that operation to go in somebody's life? What are they talking about? What are they talking about in the car? Like those type of things. Like what's going through the person's head. Chris Hedges wrote this book talking about what's war like. He was trying to give it from the perspective of a war correspondent and what people encounter when they're in those situations, how they respond, etc. Because his thing was like, maybe people need to know what it's like on the ground in those high, tense pressure situations where your life can basically be taken in a dash. The CIA's thing is different though, because they're doing renditions. Like this is not like a typical war zone. This is, we're going to snatch somebody off the street. We're going to whack this person. We're going to do a drone strike. It's a different fighting technique. It's just very interesting. That's all. But we can go to callers. Malik from DC. What's going on, Malik? Am I pronouncing that right? Malik?
It is Malik.
Malik.
He was good about correcting me. Malik from DC. Malik, what's going on, man?
It is Malik. Yeah, I appreciate it. How you doing there? No,
how's it going?
The show. I enjoyed the show today. I'm calling. I'm for a bit on a personal note, but not so much entirely. A few weeks ago, I was in a car accident, and I was hit by one of those large salt trucks, the dump trucks that you see driving around DC through the winter. And my vehicle was dragged, was thrown into a wall. Then the vehicle was dragged along the wall, and then it was T-boned and actually thrown to the other side of the truck into a median. But that's not the end of the story. About a week ago, I had found a young man hanging out near my vehicle, and I had a substance that was placed on the door handle of my vehicle and received a chemical burn and had to go to the hospital. I hadn't placed the two incidents together, but I've unfortunately been forced to actually start to make the connections. Just so you guys know, I've been extremely vocal about the vaccine, the COVID and the vaccine situation on Twitter. I've actually even gotten my account locked on Twitter because of some of the things that I've posted. Some of the things that I posted were things that Robert Kennedy had already spoken about and posted on his Twitter account, and had to subtweet him for a period to keep Twitter from locking my account. That being said, I do want to ask you guys, in terms of the end the lockdown protests that are going on globally, and I know you guys may disagree with the positions around that, but you can't necessarily dismiss those people as just Trumpers. What do you think about the people who think that there is something larger taking place here and have taken to the streets globally, except for in America where you really don't hear peep because the population tends to be a lot more controlled here. And I'll just leave that at that.
Well, I mean, another way of looking at what's going on in the States is we have a lot more latitude. And so a bunch of states have started to reopen. Things were locked down for cold and flu season. And a lot of states never had mask mandates. They never locked down to the extent that you saw in major metropolitan hubs like Los Angeles or New York City. So I think, we're a large nation. We're much more, control is much more distributed, obviously, from the federal government to the states. And so on a state-by-state basis, I just see there being less of an opportunity for people to push back against it. But I know that there was still. On the protests globally, I think I get it. I think a lot of people are worried about what they see as unprecedented intrusions into their personal privacy, their freedom of movement, and in a lot of cases, their freedom of speech. And I am also worried about that. Now, on the other side of it, I also see lockdowns, I see quarantines as an effective way to control a virus, and I think that's worked. So it's not like I'm on one side of this issue. I get it. Jamarl, what's your take? We got 2 more calls and not too much time.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I'll be quick. Look, I don't begrudge people for thinking that there are larger forces at work. When you have all sorts of policies that the American public, or for the public around the world, want, and for whatever particular reason, the best outcome seems to always be out of reach. I don't necessarily think people are insane for saying maybe there's something else going on. By the same token, oftentimes you have ideas that work in tandem with one another. So, for example, the 9/11, and then that allows for the Iraq War because you set the argument up, et cetera, and move forward from there. So I'm not of mind that it's always one thing or the other. Oftentimes, I think sometimes they're both, that it could be a measure of control. By the same token, it is also a measure of dealing with the virus. It's just so happened that they run in tandem. I'm sorry to hear about the accident, though, man. I hope you're doing all right. Let's go to Tarif. Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif?
How you doing, gentlemen? Thanks for taking my call. I had 2 comments, but I'm going to have just say one. Free joining the signs, and you also never give up, okay? What the deep state don't like is exposure. You never go toe-to-toe with them with being physical. You have to expose them with truth and facts. That's why they was scared of John F. Kennedy, MLK, and Martin Luther King. And Malcolm X and others. You have to use truth and facts. Okay.
But they did kill those people, Tarif. Those people were extinguished.
Yeah, but that's not the point. Is this? Listen, you have to go beyond. You have to stand up. You have to use truth and facts. Okay, joining signs. If you get that Nobel Peace Prize, that would help him out. Of course, the United States not going to drop the charges against him, but that could release him from Barham House prison. And maybe he can go back to Australia or maybe Iceland or somewhere. And they can fight his case, and he can, his family can heal him by giving them herbs and things like that. But never give up. You got to keep on fighting. They're human beings just like us. Okay? Never give up. The truth is in all of us. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Tarif from New Orleans, thank you for the call. Interesting idea with the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm pessimistic about it, but I'll be honest, that's the first I've heard of it, and I like it. But, my pessimism hopefully isn't warranted. Jamarl, what do you think?
Yeah, even if it gets the prize, I don't think that's going to change one iota about what Brits or Americans are going to try to do to Assange. And yes, I made the point that they did kill those people. But there's something to be said that is not entirely contextually right, because it does go beyond those people. Meaning the fact that we're talking about King or X or any of the people that he named means that something transcended the human form in regards to what they were saying and what they were doing. So maybe there's a point that maybe truth does outlive it or outlast. It's just the fact that, the human being can be broken and destroyed. So it's
in pretty much every case where one of these people got killed, they become a martyr.
Yes.
And that is obvious. And it makes me wonder why people don't see that preemptively. And the only thing I would have here is they're probably less worried about them becoming a martyr than they're worried about them continuing to lead.
Exactly.
And consequences of what might happen as they continue to lead, which means ultimately those deaths are not justified. Nothing would justify those deaths. People should have kept on living. And we can only speculate about the good that they may have done if they could have lived on and continued their work. We got to close the show out, though, folks. You have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you to all of our guests, all of our callers. Great conversations this morning. Thank you to engineer Andre, producer Mary T. Thank you, Jamarl, my co-host. And thank you, that is you, for listening to this show. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great day.
Lines, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Good show today. It wasn't a bad show at all today. Kiriakou was fascinating. And it's like, I have all of these questions on spycraft stuff. Like, what do you guys do behind the scenes? What do you guys talk about when you're about to do a mission? What do you got? That. It's like, all of that stuff is so fascinating just because it's so wild outside the context of a typical reality that people deal with or touch on a regular basis. Just like the war stuff with Chris Hedges. It's that aspect of life that is almost locked away from you, and yet it's there nonetheless. It's like, you know, these guys are doing stuff behind the scenes. You know these guys are doing nefarious stuff. You know they're making plans to whack that guy or pull that guy in rendition. You know that the government is making plans to do and throw whatever, meaning what any, it's not just one hit. It's any issue that can be brought up that can be used for political ends. It's fighting chess of sorts. It's like you're throwing up flat to keep an opponent off guard, but you're always moving, you're always attacking, you're always putting out a particular narrative in a story of events. This is the framing, and this is the propagation of this framing. The government is going to say it, it's going to give it light. The media is going to repeat what the government is saying. The reality of it matters less, especially when it's against a foreign adversary. That's unfortunate. We can't have world peace because of that premise, meaning the competition and everything else. If we have a tact that says we are not going to allow a peer nation to develop, that means we are going to be perpetually at war. And at some point, in the way that we look at other nations, in the way we look at ourselves as indispensable and superior, well, that's just our heads. That's not indicative of other groups. And we will come at odds the moment we take that perspective against somebody who ends up being a peer and that can give us a bloody nose. And we can easily slip into some kind of larger war. Look, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe, and I will see you guys a little bit later today. Thanks, everyone. Oh, by the way, make sure you subscribe. YouTube has been doing pretty dodgy stuff. Thanks all. Zachy, yeah. And as long as AIPAC is in charge, that too. But keep in mind, they're used as a weapon. Like, the U.S. uses Israel as its attack dog in the Middle East. I mean, even complete with nuclear weapons. And so it's like, yes, there may be an interlocking back and forth. But let's be clear, U.S. does get something out of that. And Israel, yeah, it gets something out of wanting to fight to the last dead American. So there's that. Like, share,